She had no name, no past, no face in any mirror she could trust. For 5 years, the man called Derek had fed her lies with her morning tea and silence with her evening bread, until the night she heard him weeping into a bottle of black wine, muttering the one sentence that unraveled everything. If she ever remembers what she is, Morvena will gut me like a river fish. Leora Vale, the girl with no yesterday, pressed her back against the rotting cabin wall, heart thundering, and made the most dangerous decision of her young life. She ran, and running, she would discover, was the first true thing she had ever done. Welcome back, everyone. If this is your first time here, buckle up, because today's story is one you will not want to stop halfway through. We're going deep into the frozen north, into a world of wolf-blooded kings, stolen identities, and a girl who was erased from history, but refused to stay forgotten. Stay until the very end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The cabin smelled like rot and regret. It had always smelled that way. Ever since the first morning Leora opened her eyes in it, 17 years old and shaking, staring at a water-stained ceiling with no memory of how she had arrived, no memory of her mother's face, no memory of her own last name. The man who called himself Derek had told her she was nobody. A girl from a burned village, a rescued orphan. She was lucky, he said, that he had found her, lucky that he kept her fed, lucky that he asked so little in return. Lucky. Leora had spent 5 years believing that word. Now she was 22, and luck had begun to taste like poison. The forest surrounding the cabin was called the Ashwood, a massive, lightless sprawl of dead elms and black pines that stretched for 40 miles in every direction. No roads cut through it. No travelers wandered into it. In 5 years, Leora had never seen another human face besides Derek's, a square, weathered, perpetually suspicious face that watched her the way a man watches a fire he isn't certain he can control. He gave her tasks: firewood, skins to cure, roots to boil. He gave her a small shelf of books, old histories, medicinal guides, a battered atlas with half the pages torn out. He gave her just enough of the world to keep her from going mad, and not one drop more. Every morning, without fail, he set a clay cup beside her sleeping mat. "Drink," he would say, "for your health." She had always drunk it. The tea was bitter and dark, and it made the edges of things go soft, the way grief goes soft when you've cried for it long enough. She thought it was medicine. She thought the dull pressure behind her eyes every night, the fragments of dream that dissolved before she could grasp them, the inexplicable ache in her chest every full moon. She thought all of it was simply the nature of being damaged, of being, as Derek reminded her, nobody. But the full moon 3 nights ago had been different. It had been the worst one yet. She had woken at midnight with her whole body burning, not the gentle warmth of fever, but something seismic, something structural, as if her bones were trying to rearrange themselves. She had bitten through her own lip to keep from screaming. In the darkness, she had pressed both hands flat against her sternum and felt something pressing back. Something ancient and enormous and furious, caged so deep inside her that even she hadn't known it was there. She hadn't drunk the morning tea that day. She'd poured it into the dirt when Derek wasn't looking. And by evening, the world had gone sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. The colors were brighter. The sounds of the forest were clearer. She could hear a rabbit moving through the underbrush 40 yards away, could hear the particular creak of Derek's chair that meant he was reaching for the wine. Her own thoughts, usually gentle and foggy and obedient, had begun to crystallize into something harder, something that asked questions. Why does he never let me near the road? Why does he burn every letter that arrives on the 1st of the month? Why does he watch the sky on full moon nights like a man waiting for an execution? She was thinking those exact questions on the night everything changed, sitting in the shadows of the doorway while Derek sat at the table with his bottle of black wine, the expensive kind, the kind he only drank when something had frightened him. He was frightened tonight. She could smell it on him, and the fact that she could smell it, the cold metallic scent of a man's fear, should have alarmed her. But the sharpness in her mind only filed the detail away, precise and calm. He was talking to himself. He did that when he drank deep enough. Usually it was complaints about the cold, about the cost of supply runs, about the isolation. Tonight, it was different. 5 years, he muttered, tilting the bottle. 5 years of this damned forest, and she's still not grateful. Still watches me like she's trying to see through walls. He drank, set the bottle down too hard. Should have taken the Queen's gold and been done with it the first year. Should have. He cut himself off, rubbed a hand over his face. Can't. She'd know. She'd know if the girl was dead, she said. Blood-bound, she said. Keep her breathing and keep her dumb and collect the coin. Another long drink. But if she ever remembers, if she ever figures out what she is... He laughed, and it was a terrible sound, scraped hollow by fear. Morvena will gut me like a river fish. Leora stood in the doorway and did not breathe. Morvena. The name landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out through everything. Through the fog that had lived behind her eyes for 5 years. Through the blurred edges and the soft, comfortable nothing of her daily existence. She didn't know the name. She had no memory of a face to attach to it. But her body knew it. Her hands had gone cold. Her heartbeat had changed. Not faster, but heavier, each thud deliberate as a war drum. If she ever remembers what she is, what she was, not who, what. Leora looked down at her own hands, rough from 5 years of work, calloused and chapped. And for the first time in her memory, she had the staggering, vertiginous sense that they were not the whole story. That there was more to her than this cabin, this forest, this carefully constructed nobodiness. She looked at Derek slumped back. At the table where, beneath a loose floorboard she had discovered 2 winters ago and never mentioned, he kept a lockbox. Inside the lockbox, she knew this because she had listened carefully and remembered everything, even through the fog, was money, a horse's tack, and a key. Outside, in the lean-to off the back of the cabin, was a horse, a big gray gelding named Stone, who Derek rode on his monthly supply runs, and who Leora had been secretly feeding apple scraps and speaking softly to for 2 years, because she was lonely and because Stone was the only creature in the ashwood that had ever looked at her without calculation. Derek's breathing had gone deep and slow. The bottle had tipped sideways in his grip. Leora moved. She moved the way she hadn't known she could move, silent, precise, fluid in the dark. She eased across the floor on bare feet, lifted the loose board without a sound, and opened the lockbox with hands that did not shake. She took the money. She took the tack. She left the key because she had no use for it, and something in her refused to be petty in this moment. She took the atlas, the one with the torn pages, because it was the only map she had ever seen, and she needed to know which direction led away from here. She dressed in the dark, wool trousers, 2 shirts, Derek's heaviest coat, which smelled like pine sap and resentment and fit her like a tent. She braided her hair back with practiced hands, and she walked out the front door into the cold black night without looking back. Stone was awake when she entered the lean-to, his dark eyes finding her immediately, ears swiveling forward with something that looked almost like recognition. She saddled him quickly and quietly, and when she swung up onto his back, he stood perfectly still, not with the stillness of a trained horse, but with the stillness of an animal who has been waiting. "Okay," she whispered to him, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "We're going north." She didn't know why north. She hadn't looked at the atlas yet. It was simply the direction that pulled at something in her chest like a hook, and she was done ignoring what her body knew. She rode into the ashwood, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The forest was brutal. She had known the ashwood was large. She'd heard Derek curse its size on every return from a supply run, complaining about the days lost to the trees. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it on horseback, alone, in the black hours before dawn, were different things entirely. The paths were narrow and treacherous, cutting between root systems that rose from the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. Low branches caught at her face and shoulders. The cold was so complete that her breath came out in thick plumes, and after the first hour, her fingers ached with it despite the gloves she'd found in the coat's pockets. But she did not slow down. She rode through the first night and into the gray, grudging dawn of the second day, stopping only when Stone needed water and rest. She slept in the saddle twice without meaning to, jerking awake each time with her heart slamming and her eyes wild, scanning the trees for Derek's silhouette. On the second morning, she found a stream and drank from it on her knees, and the cold water hit her system like a bell being struck, clear and resonant and real in a way that nothing had felt real in 5 years. She was hungry. She was exhausted. Every muscle in her body had opinions about horseback riding that she was unprepared for. She was, for the first time she could remember, entirely alive. The atlas, consulted in the thin gray morning light, was frustrating. Half the regional markers had been torn away along with the missing pages, and she couldn't be certain which portion of the map she was looking at. But the northern territories were clear enough. A vast stretch of high country, labeled in old script as the Dravenlands, bordered by a mountain range called the Greymaw, and, her eyes caught on this, a fortress marked with a symbol she didn't recognize, a circle bisected by a single vertical line, positioned at the edge of what the atlas called the Wolf Roads. She had no particular feeling about fortresses. She had a very particular feeling about north. She kept riding. On the third day, the forest thinned and the land began to climb. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the ash trees gave way to ancient, enormous conifers whose canopies blocked the sky almost entirely. The light that filtered through was blue-green and strange, and the silence was of the deep, deliberate kind. The silence of a place that has its own heartbeat and doesn't much welcome interruption. Leora found herself holding her breath at intervals without meaning to, listening. The ache in her chest had changed. It had been her constant companion for 5 years, that monthly pressure, that sense of something caged. But now, in its 5th year, without the morning tea dulling it down, it had become directional. It pulled. Not painfully, but insistently, the way a compass needle swings to true north. It was pulling her forward and slightly west, toward the deepening cold and the mountains visible now as a gray smear on the horizon. "You feel it too?" she asked Stone. The horse flicked an ear back at her. Didn't slow. "Yeah," she said. "Me neither. Let's not talk about it." She'd begun talking to the horse on the second day. It helped. Silence, she was discovering, had been another one of Derek's tools, keeping her cut off not just from other people but from the sound of her own voice, her own thoughts given shape and air. She talked to Stone about the atlas, about the trees changing, about the cold, about the name Morvena that she couldn't stop turning over. She talked about the ache in her chest. She talked about the dreams she'd had in the last 3 nights without the tea, fragmented, blazing things, images that came apart the moment she tried to hold them. A fire-lit hall, a man's laughing face, a woman with white hair standing at a high window, her back turned, a small girl running barefoot across cold stone, laughing. She didn't know if the small girl was her. She was beginning to suspect it was. The attack came on the afternoon of the 4th day. She heard them before she saw them, 2 men moving fast through the trees to her right, not bothering with stealth because they didn't think she could hear them. She could hear them very clearly, the crack of branches, the metallic jingle of tack, the low exchange of voices. One said a name. Not hers. Someone else's name, given as an order. She had already turned Stone and kicked him into a gallop before the first rider broke through the tree line. They were good riders. She was not. But Stone was. Stone was extraordinary, it turned out, picking his footing through the forest undergrowth with a sureness that made her wonder, distantly, where Derek had gotten him, because this horse did not move like a man's workhorse. Stone moved like an animal with purpose, taking the terrain in long, confident strides, and Leora bent low over his neck and held on and trusted him in the way she hadn't trusted anything in 5 years. The riders were gaining. She could hear the second one now, louder, closer, angling to cut her off. She adjusted, pulling Stone left, and they burst through a wall of undergrowth onto a narrow ridge path, and suddenly they were flying, the trees dropping away on her right into a steep valley, the wind screaming past her ears, the cold so sharp it brought tears that froze before they fell. The ridge path curved. She didn't see the ice. Stone hit it and went down hard. Not falling, catching himself with heroic effort, scrambling sideways, but the momentum was enough. Leora's grip failed. She came off his back at speed and hit the frozen ground and rolled. And the world turned sideways and inside out, and she was aware, dimly, of snow and sky, and the sound of hoofbeats that were neither stones nor her pursuers. Different hoofbeats, slower, already stopped. Something caught her. Not the ground, not a tree, something that moved, something large and warm and solid. And she was suddenly still. The rolling and the cold and the spinning all ceased, and she was pressed against a chest that was hard as the mountain stone and radiating heat like a banked forge. And arms had come around her that were unmistakably, irrevocably certain, the grip of someone who does not drop things. She looked up. The man above her was tall, unreasonably so, with a face that looked like it had been made by someone who considered softness a structural weakness. Sharp jaw, strong brow, dark hair that the wind was doing nothing to. He was dressed in black, heavy riding gear that did nothing to disguise the sheer physical authority of the person inside it, and he was completely, utterly still in the way that apex predators are still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something powerful that has chosen, for the moment, not to move. His eyes were open, gray as the Gray Maw Mountains behind him. They were looking in her direction. They were not seeing her. He was blind, and he was looking at her as if he could see something anyway, something she couldn't account for, some quality of attention in those unseen eyes that felt, impossibly, more present than most sighted people she'd encountered. "Who are you?" His voice was low, and the authority in it was not performed. It was structural. It was load-bearing. Behind her she heard the two riders slow to a stop. She heard one of them dismount. She heard, in the quality of the silence that followed, that these men were afraid of the man holding her, afraid in the specific way that men are afraid of someone who can hurt them and might choose to. She looked at his face again. Something in her chest, the ache, the presence, the caged and furious thing, went suddenly, catastrophically quiet. Not gone, not suppressed, arrived, like a river meeting the sea. "I don't know," she said, which was the truest thing she had said in 5 years. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. "You're bleeding." She became aware of the pain in her shoulder. Not the crash, something else. Something that had clipped her in the chaos of the pursuit that she'd been too flooded with adrenaline to register. She looked down. There was blood on Derek's coat, spreading darkly through the wool. "Apparently," she said. One of the men behind her spoke, a careful, precise voice. "My Lord Kale, we found her on the ridge. She appeared to be— I can see what she appeared to be, Aldrich." A pause. He still hadn't moved. Still hadn't released her, she noticed. She was being chased. The riders fled when they saw— "I know." His voice hadn't changed, but something in the air had. "Get the camp physician. Now." She felt his arms adjust, redistributing her weight, and understood that he intended to carry her, and this was the point at which some remaining fragment of pride attempted to reassert itself. "I can walk," she said. "You're bleeding in at least one place you haven't found yet, and you just fell off a horse at speed on an ice ridge," he said, with the patient certainty of a man stating geological fact. "You cannot walk." He was right. Her left knee, she realized, had stopped reporting to her entirely. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. He was already moving, carrying her with the offhand ease of someone for whom other people's weight is simply not a relevant consideration. "But you're injured in my territory, and someone was trying to hurt you. That makes you my concern until you're not. That's a very arbitrary basis for concern. It's the only kind I have." She should have been frightened. She was 22 years old, injured, 5 days from the only home she'd known in memory, with no name that meant anything and no past she could access and no idea whose agents had just been chasing her through a frozen forest. She was not frightened. She was, instead, and irrationally, more settled than she had been since the morning she'd stopped drinking the tea, as if her nervous system, which had been braced for impact for 5 days, had looked at the man carrying her through the mountain cold and said, "Here. This is the thing you were running toward." She looked at the gray eyes that couldn't see her. The ache in her chest was quiet, not gone. Home. The encampment was a military one, functional, efficient, organized with the kind of unconscious precision that suggested the man in charge simply expected order and received it without having to ask. Black tents in neat rows, well-fed horses, guards who moved with purpose rather than performance. When Kyle Draven walked into camp with her in his arms, the activity didn't stop. It redirected, soldiers finding things to look at in other directions with a collective wordless tact that told Liora this man's privacy was considered and protected here. The camp physician was a small, sharp-eyed woman named Petra, who had the manner of someone who has seen too many battlefield wounds to be impressed by any of them but retains a fierce and personal opinion about proper wound care. She took one look at Liora and another look at Kyle and said, with the specific neutrality of someone choosing their battles, "I'll need her inside and quiet for the examination." "You'll have it," Kyle said. He set Liora down on a camp cot with a care that was entirely at odds with the general impression of him as someone who did not do careful things, and straightened. "She stays in my camp until she can ride or until she tells me where she needs to go." "And if I tell you I need to go immediately?" Liora said. He turned his blind gaze toward her with that unsettling accuracy. "Then I'll get you a horse and an escort." No hesitation. "You're not a prisoner, but I'd like to know why 2 men were trying to run you down in the Greymaw foothills before you go." "So would I," she said. Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable, there and gone. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk when Petra's done." He left without waiting for her response, and Liora lay back on the cot while Petra began cutting away the ruined coat with practiced, merciless efficiency and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent and tried to reconstruct everything she knew about herself. It didn't take long. She had woken at 17 with no memory. She had lived 5 years in an isolated cabin, being fed lies and drugged tea by a man named Derek, who was being paid by someone named Morvena to keep her docile and amnesiac. She had a capacity for hearing and moving in the dark that she was fairly certain was not standard. She had an ache in her chest that responded to the full moon and, apparently, to the presence of a blind king in the mountains. Someone had tried to kill her on the ridge. Not Derek's men. The riders were too well armed and mounted for that. Morvena's, then, or someone who knew she'd run. And she had a feeling, growing stronger by the hour, thick and insistent as the scent of pine in the cold air, that the fragments of dreams she'd been chasing for 5 years were not dreams at all. "You've been malnourished," Petra said, without looking up from the wound she was cleaning. "Deliberately, I'd guess. The muscle loss is consistent with long-term caloric restriction and—" She paused. "Mild pharmacological suppression." Liora turned her head. "The tea." Petra's eyes met hers. "What was in it?" "I don't know. Bitter, dark, made everything soft. Blood moss extract, probably. With something else." Petra's mouth had gone thin and precise. "I've seen it used before. It suppresses the body's natural—" She stopped. "Natural what?" "Healing," Petra said, after a beat that was slightly too long. "Natural healing responses. Common in cases where someone's been injured and the healer wants to prevent complications." She went back to the wound. Her hands were very steady. She was lying. Not the way Derek had lied, with the whole body, with the reflexive ease of someone who had built their entire existence on deception. Petra was lying the small, specific way that someone lies when they know a truth that isn't theirs to tell. A professional lie. A careful one. Liora filed it away. "The man who carried me in," she said. "Kyle Draven. Tell me about him." Petra's hands kept moving. "He's the king of the Northern Realms, has been for 9 years. Took the throne at 23 after his father died in the border wars. He's—" A pause. "Highly effective. He's blind. Has been for 5 years." Petra tied off a bandage. "No injury. No disease that the physicians could identify. One morning he woke and the sight was gone. Some say it's a curse." Her voice was scrupulously neutral. "Some say it's hereditary. He's never discussed it publicly." 5 years, Liora said. Petra glanced up. "He's been blind for 5 years, Liora said. I've had no memory for 5 years." Petra was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the camp, rattling canvas, carrying the cold scent of pine and distance. "Rest," she said finally. "You need it." She didn't answer the connection Leora had just laid out between them, didn't deny it either. Leora closed her eyes. Beneath her ribs, the quiet, waiting thing that she had carried for 5 years pulsed once, like a second heartbeat finding its rhythm, and was still. She slept, and she did not dream. For the first time in 5 years, she did not dream, because the thing that had been trying to wake her no longer needed to. She was already awake. Thus, the conversation with Kyle Draven came late in the evening, when the camp had grown quiet and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes darkness feel physical, a presence rather than an absence. Petra had fed her, bullied her into drinking 2 full cups of broth, and informed her that the wound was clean and would not trouble her provided she did not do anything inadvisable in the next 48 hours, a qualifier she delivered with the meaningful emphasis of someone who had assessed Leora's general orientation toward inadvisable decisions and found it concerning. Kale came to the tent alone. He moved through the dark with the absolute confidence of a man to whom darkness was simply a standard condition. No hesitation, no reaching hands, no tentative exploration of the space. He knew where the camp cot was. He sat in the chair beside it and angled his face toward her with that precise, uncanny accuracy, and Leora had the sudden conviction that whatever he'd lost 5 years ago, it had been replaced by something else. Something that worked differently, but worked. "Your name," he said. "Leora," she said. "Leora Vale." A pause. "Or that's what I was told." "You don't know your own name." "I don't know most things about myself. Someone worked hard to make that true." "Derek," he said. She went still. "How do you—" "One of the men who was chasing you is in my custody." He talked quickly. Something moved through his expression, not quite contempt, but proximate to it. "He was hired, given a name and a description, and told to stop you before you reached the Grey Maw. He didn't know why." He paused. "He knew who hired him." "Morvena," Leora said. Silence. It was not the silence of confirmation. It was heavier than that. It was the silence of a man rearranging things he thought he knew. "Queen Morvenus," he said, slowly. "Of the southern reaches." "I don't know her. I only know her name because I heard Derek say it." Leora pushed herself upright on the cot, ignoring the protest from her shoulder. "He said she was paying him to keep me—" She searched for the word. "Contained. He said if I ever remembered who I was, she'd kill him." "Who are you?" His voice was careful now. The carefulness of a man who is asking a question he suspects will change things. "I told you, I don't know." "What do you know?" She looked at his face, the blind gray eyes that found her with impossible precision, and decided, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, to tell him everything. All of it. The 5 years. The tea. The full moon ache. The dreams she couldn't hold. The way the forest felt like memory rather than landscape. The direction that pulled her north. The way his presence had quieted, for the first time, the thing inside her chest. She told him all of it, and he sat in the lamplight and listened with the complete absolute attention of someone for whom every piece of information is worth something. And when she was done, the silence stretched out between them for a long time. "The mark on your left wrist," he said finally, "the one Petra covered with the bandage. The scar that isn't a scar." She looked down. Under the bandage, she knew without looking, there was a mark she'd had as long as she could remember. A circle bisected by a single vertical line, pale against her skin. The kind of mark that wasn't raised or indented but simply present, as if it had been put there by something that didn't need to cut. She looked at the atlas, which Petra had set on the small table beside the cot, the symbol on the fortress in the northern territories. The circle bisected by a vertical line, the symbol of the house that owned these mountains, Kale Draven's house. He was very still. "I've been looking for someone," he said, and his voice had changed, stripped of the careful control, down to something underneath that was neither the king's authority nor the soldier's precision, but something older and rawer than either. "For 5 years, something that was—" He stopped. started again. Something was taken from me. At the same time, my sight went. Something I couldn't name or explain, only feel as an absence. The way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. He paused. Every full moon, it was worse. Leora's hands had gone very still in her lap. Every full moon, she said. Yes. Outside, the wind moved through the camp. The lamp between them wavered. What do you think it means? She asked, though she was beginning with the accelerating, terrifying clarity that had been building since the morning she stopped drinking the tea, to know. He turned his face toward her fully, and for one dizzying second, she could have sworn that his gray eyes focused. Not with sight, with something else, something that saw her in a frequency that vision doesn't cover. I think, he said very quietly, that whoever took your memories was also trying to take something from me. He paused, and I think they almost succeeded. The thing in her chest pulsed, not quietly this time, like a door being knocked on from the inside. Not yet, she thought at it, and didn't know why she was sure it would listen. Only that it would. Only that it had been waiting 5 years and could wait a little longer. She looked at the blind king in the lamplight, at the circle and line mark on her own wrist, at the atlas with its torn pages, at the road she'd ridden north without knowing why. Tell me about the Dravenlands, she said, and Kael Draven, king of the northern wolf realms, tilted his head slightly and began to speak, and outside the tent, the mountain dark pressed close and cold against the canvas, and somewhere far to the south, a queen named Morvena woke from sleep with her heart slamming and her hands shaking and a certainty cold as iron that something had gone wrong. That the girl she had spent 5 years erasing had just walked into the one place she'd spent 5 years keeping her away from. That the thing she'd done, the thing that couldn't be undone, had just run out of time. In the Ashwood cabin, 40 miles south, a man named Derek woke to find his horse and his lockbox and his heaviest coat gone, and sat for a long time at his table with the last of his black wine, knowing with the specific certainty of someone who has spent 5 years in the service of a terrible secret that his usefulness had just expired. He thought about running. He thought about it for a long time. But 40 miles away, in a mountain camp, a girl with no name was having her first honest conversation in 5 years, and somewhere in the deep dark of her chest, something ancient and white and enormous was pacing, patient and certain and almost ready. And the wolf always finds the one who runs. The fortress of Dravenhold had stood for 300 years at the spine of the Greymaw Mountains, and in that time it had seen wars, famines, 3 successions of violent kings, and one winter so catastrophic that the chronicles referred to it simply as the Silence, the season when the cold killed everything that wasn't stone. It had outlasted all of it. The walls were black granite quarried from the mountain itself, 4 feet thick at the narrowest point, and the towers rose into the cloud cover like accusations. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. It was meant to last. And it had. And the people who lived and served inside it had taken on something of its character, durable, efficient, unsentimental about softness. They were not, Leora discovered on the morning of her arrival, prepared for her. The journey from the mountain camp to Dravenhold took the better part of a day on horseback, east along the ridge road, then north through a pass that the wind had turned into something resembling a physical argument, then down into a valley that was somehow colder than the peaks above it, where the fortress rose from the rock as if it had grown there. Kael rode at the front of the column without a guide, navigating by sound and memory and whatever 6th orientation he'd developed in 5 blind years, and Leora rode beside him on a borrowed horse, smaller than stone, less intuitive, but willing, and watched the landscape change and felt the pull in her chest grow stronger with every mile. She didn't speak much on the ride, neither did he. There was a quality to the silence between them that she found herself examining with the careful attention she'd been giving everything since she stopped the tea. It wasn't comfortable exactly, because comfort implied ease, and nothing about either of them inclined toward ease. It was more like the silence of 2 people who have each independently concluded that words are an inefficient medium and are temporarily content to use it sparingly. Aldrich, Kael's second, a lean, watchful man in his 30s with the particular quality of someone who has made peace with the fact that his primary function is anticipating problems, rode close enough to hear but far enough to project an aggressive lack of interest in the conversation, which told Leora he was listening to every word. The gates of Dravenhold opened before they reached them. The guards who opened them were staring at her, all of them, with the specific expression of people attempting to appear as if they weren't staring while manifestly staring, and she had the sudden dislocating experience of realizing that her arrival, a wounded stranger on a borrowed horse, had already somehow acquired the weight of an event. "They know you're here," Kael said, without turning his head. I gathered. "The camp sends riders ahead, standard protocol." A pause. "They'll have questions." "I have questions too." "I know." Something shifted in his voice, not quite dry, but adjacent to it. "You'll find that somewhat fewer of them get answered here." This proved accurate. The inner courtyard of Dravenhold was where she first encountered the court, a word she applied loosely to the assembled cluster of advisors, nobles, and high-ranking military officers who had gathered with the practiced, unconvincing casualness of people who absolutely had not sprinted to the courtyard the moment the gate messenger arrived. There were perhaps 20 of them. Their expressions ran a narrow spectrum from suspicion to outright hostility, with a few outliers in the category of performative neutrality that fooled nobody. A woman in the front of the group stepped forward. She was perhaps 50, dressed in dark blue that probably cost more than the cabin Leora had lived in for 5 years, and she had the face of someone who had spent decades being the most intelligent person in most rooms and had stopped being tactful about it. "My Lord Kael," she said, with a precision that suggested she was choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "We weren't informed of a guest." "The situation was not pre-planned, Counselor Veth," Kael said. He had dismounted with the fluid ease of long habit and handed his reins to a groom without looking, and now stood with that particular stillness that Leora was beginning to understand was his default register. "Leora Vale. She was injured in my territory. She's under my protection until further notice." "Of course," Veth said. Her eyes, quick, black, and comprehensive, moved from Kael to Leora with the speed and thoroughness of an assessment. "And what is her provenance?" "That's being established." "By whom?" "By me," Kael said, with a finality that was not unkind but was also not up for discussion. "She'll be given quarters in the East Wing, appropriate clothing and supplies." He paused. "And she's not to be questioned by anyone until I've spoken with her further. Is that clear?" The counselor's mouth compressed. "My lord, with the trade delegation arriving in 3 days, and Lady Seraphine's party expected within the fortnight—" "Clear?" Kael repeated. Veth inclined her head. "Perfectly clear." But her eyes, still on Leora, were not clear at all. They were full of the specific calculating light of a woman doing very fast arithmetic on a problem she hadn't expected to encounter today. Leora returned the look without flinching. She had lived 5 years with a man who watched her the way predators watch uncertain prey. She was not going to be cowed by a counselor in expensive wool. The East Wing quarters were, by any standard Leora had access to, extraordinary. A set of connected rooms with stone walls covered in tapestries, a fireplace that someone had already lit, a bed that was approximately the size of the entire sleeping area of the Ashwood cabin. She stood in the center of the main room after the attendant left, and looked at all of it and felt, for the first time since she'd fled, the profound and slightly alarming reality of where she was. She was inside a fortress controlled by a man she had met 18 hours ago. She had no allies here. She had no past that anyone could verify. She had a wound in her shoulder, a mark on her wrist that matched the king's house symbol, a name she wasn't certain was hers, and a growing bone-deep certainty that the thing she couldn't remember was going to resurface whether she was ready or not. She sat on the edge of the bed, stood up again, walked to the window. The window looked north over the valley, toward higher mountains, and the light was the gray-white of late morning in cold country, and she stood there and let herself be still for the first time in 5 days and tried to assess. Someone named Morvena had paid Derek to keep her isolated, drugged, and amnesiac for 5 years. That same someone had sent riders to intercept her when she ran. Kael's camp had captured one of those riders, which meant Morvena would know shortly. if she didn't already, that the intercept had failed and that Leora was now inside Dravenhold. The counselor Veth had mentioned Lady Seraphine arriving within the fortnight, and the way she'd said it, with the weight of an established plan, something load-bearing in the political architecture of the fortress, suggested that Seraphine's visit was significant, connected perhaps to a political alliance, a marriage possibly, which meant she had landed, without intending to, in the middle of something that was already complicated before she arrived. Good, said the sharpened, tea-free version of her mind, with a pragmatism that mildly surprised her. Complicated things have more moving parts, more places to find the truth. A knock at the door. Not the attendant's knock. She could already distinguish the attendant's knock, quick and soft, from this one, which was deliberate and carried the authority of someone who was not asking permission so much as announcing imminent entry. "Come in," she said. Petra came in, which was not who she'd expected, and was carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of someone who has arrived with a purpose. "How's the shoulder?" she said, setting the satchel on the table. "Functional." "That's not what I asked." She gestured at the chair. "Sit. I want to check it in better light than a camp tent." Leora sat, let Petra undo the bandage with efficient hands, looked at her profile in the window light. "You came from the camp specifically," Leora said. "You didn't have to." "No." "Why did you?" Petra was quiet for a moment, examining the wound with a focus that might or might not have been entirely about the wound. "Because," she said finally, "I've served in this fortress for 11 years. And in 11 years, I've seen Lord Kael face down 2 assassination attempts, a border war, a coup by his own uncle, and 5 years of blindness that would have broken most men entirely." She paused, reapplied salve with neat strokes. "I've never seen him carry someone in from the cold." Leora said nothing. "He doesn't do that," Petra continued. "He's not a cold man, but he's a contained one. People don't get carried here. They get assessed and they get assigned." She began rebandaging. "Whatever happened on that ridge, it changed something in him. I could see it when he walked in. And I've known him long enough that changes in Kael Draven are notable." "What do you think happened?" Petra finished the bandage, met her eyes. "I think," she said, with the same careful precision she'd used in the camp tent, "that you should be very careful in this fortress. There are people here who will see your arrival as a threat to things they've spent years arranging." A pause. "And I think you should know that the last time someone arrived at Dravenhold unexpectedly and changed the balance of things, they didn't leave." The silence had edges. "Alive?" Leora said. "No," Petra said. She picked up her satchel. "Alive. They didn't leave alive." She moved to the door, then stopped, looked back over her shoulder. "I'd recommend not eating or drinking anything you didn't watch being prepared. And I'd recommend getting very familiar with the layout of the East Wing, specifically the exits." She left. Leora sat in the chair for a long moment, looking at the closed door. Then she got up and began memorizing the layout of the East Wing. Quotes. The hostility was not subtle. She had expected some version of it. She wasn't naive about what her presence looked like from the outside. A wounded, unnamed woman with no verifiable past who had arrived in the Lord's arms and been installed in the East Wing with unusual speed and explicit protection. In a fortress full of people whose positions depended on knowing the full ledger of everything that happened here. She was a column of numbers that didn't add up, and columns that don't add up make powerful people nervous, and nervous, powerful people do not, in Leora's limited experience, trend toward generosity. What she hadn't expected was how fast it moved. By the second morning, the attendant assigned to her was delivering meals that were, she noted, eating nothing from them after Petra's warning, slightly delayed. By the second afternoon, 2 of the guards who had been stationed at the end of the East Wing corridor had been replaced with men whose body language was less protection and more observation. By the second evening, Counselor Veth had materialized in the corridor outside her room with 2 other advisors, and the conversation that followed had the surface texture of a welcome, but the underlying current of an interrogation. "We understand you came from the Ashwood region," Veth said. They were standing in the corridor rather than sitting in Leora's rooms, which meant Veth was controlling the geography. Keeping this informal, keeping it deniable. Smart. I did, Leora said. Do you have family there? No? Connections? A village? I had a cabin, Leora said, and a man who told me I was nobody. I've recently begun questioning that assessment. Veth's eyes sharpened. Lord Kael hasn't provided the council with details of your situation. That's between Lord Kael and the council. You understand, Veth said carefully, that there are concerns. A woman with no verifiable history, no name that can be checked, no family that can be contacted, arriving injured in our Lord's arms during a period of considerable diplomatic sensitivity. What would you like me to do about it? Leora said. Veth blinked. Specifically, Leora continued, keeping her voice level, I understand the concern. I share most of it because I'm the one who doesn't know her own past, which is more disconcerting for me than it is for you, I assure you. What specific action would address the council's worry? A pause. Information, Veth said. Background. Something that can be verified. When I have it, you'll have it. She met the counselor's gaze. I'm not a threat to this fortress or to Lord Kael. I'm a woman who ran from someone who was hiding me and ended up here. That's the whole truth of what I know. If that changes, I'll tell him immediately. Veth looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind the black eyes. Reassessment, possibly. The recognition that the girl in front of her was not going to be easily managed. The diplomatic situation is delicate, Veth said, quietly now, the performance stripped away. Lady Seraphine arrives in 11 days. Her mother, Queen Morvena, has spent 2 years negotiating this alliance. Lord Kael's marriage to Seraphine would end 40 years of border tension and open the southern trade routes. It is, by any calculation, necessary. She paused. Your presence, the circumstances of your arrival, have the potential to complicate that significantly. Morvena. The name landed in Leora's chest like a cold key in a cold lock. Lady Seraphine, Queen Morvena's daughter. Kael was supposed to marry Queen Morvena's daughter, the woman who had paid Derek to keep her erased for 5 years. The woman who had sent riders to stop her before she reached the mountains. The woman who had, with a certainty that was settling into Leora's bones like cold into stone, done something to her. Something that had stolen 5 years of her life and blinded a king. That woman's daughter was coming here in 11 days to marry Kael Draven, and Leora was standing in his east wing. She kept her face still. She had had 5 years of practice keeping her face still around a man who was watching for weakness. I understand the delicacy, she said. Thank you for telling me. Veth nodded once, turned, and left with her advisors in tow. When they were gone, Leora went back into her room and stood at the window and stared north at the mountains and felt the thing in her chest turning slowly, like a compass needle finding its bearing. Morvena. Whatever she was, whatever she had been before the cabin, and the tea, and the 5 years of careful erasure, Morvena had decided it was worth a sustained and expensive effort to keep her from being it. Worth assassins. Worth a political marriage specifically positioned to maintain access to the man Leora had apparently been running toward. She needed to find Kael. She needed to tell him what Veth had just told her. She needed to do it before anyone in this fortress decided that the simplest solution to the complication she represented was the permanent kind. Finding Kael alone was harder than she'd anticipated. He was not, as she had vaguely assumed fortress lords to be, installed in a throne room receiving petitioners. He was, she discovered through a process of careful observation and one frank conversation with a young stable hand named Corin, who seemed to have not yet received the memo about not talking to her, most frequently found in either the war room, the training yard, or the lower library. The one, Corin explained with the slightly odd tones of someone repeating a story they'd absorbed through fortress osmosis, that he'd had restocked after losing his sight, with every text transcribed into a tactile format so he could read by touch. She found him in the library on the evening of her second day. He was at the central table, one hand moving across a page of raised text, and he didn't look up when she entered, though she had no doubt he knew who it was before she crossed the threshold. Counselor Veth told you about Seraphine, he said. She stopped. Is it that obvious? You're moving differently than you were this morning. More deliberate, He set his hand flat on the page. Veth is efficient. I expected her to find you. You expected it. She came further into the library, stopping on the other side of the table. And you didn't warn me. I wanted to see what you'd do with the information. She looked at him across the table, the blind king in the library light entirely composed, watching her with those eyes that saw nothing and missed nothing. The anger that moved through her was quick and clean and completely rational. That's a test, she said. Everything is a test when I can't see someone's face, he said, without apology, but without cruelty either. You passed. Veth came back to me an hour ago and reported that you were, and this is her word, composed. Coming from Veth, that's a considerable endorsement. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I realized when she mentioned Morvena's name. He went very still. She told him. All of it. The connection she'd made, the shape of it, the specific and terrible logic of Morvena arranging a marriage alliance with Kael while simultaneously arranging for Lyora to be kept a nobody in the Ashwood. How the two things, laid side by side, stopped looking like coincidence. When she finished, the silence in the library was absolute. You think she did something to both of us, he said. I think she arranged something that required both of us to be separated, neutralized. She paused. I don't know what I am to you. I don't know what she took from me that made you go blind, but I think we were supposed to be something together that she couldn't allow. Supposed to be, he said, and his voice had changed again, down to that stripped, raw register she'd heard in the camp tent. That's an interesting construction. Do you have a better one? A pause. He stood, and the room rearranged itself around his movement in the way rooms do when the person standing up in them is the person all the furniture has been oriented toward. The mark on your wrist, he said, the sigil. I need you to describe it to me. She undid the bandage Petra had wrapped around her forearm, held her wrist under the lamp. Circle, she said, divided by a vertical line. Clean edges, not cut, just present. The skin color slightly lighter around it. His jaw tightened. When I was 12, he said slowly, my father showed me a document, a prophetic record, written by the last seer of the Grey Maw lineage before she died. It described two wolves, a black wolf and a white wolf, bonded before birth, whose union would stabilize the northern and southern realms. It described a mark. He paused. The sigil of the bond, which would appear on both of them. The lamp flickered. Both of them, Lyora said. He held up his right hand. On the inside of his wrist, beneath the cuff of his riding shirt, she saw it. The same mark. Circle, vertical line, pale against his skin. The thing in her chest didn't pulse this time. It roared. A silent, massive surge of recognition, like a wave cresting, and she grabbed the table edge and breathed through it, and when it subsided, she was still standing, and her hands were steady, and the world was very, very clear. She knew, Lyora said. Morvena knew about the prophecy. She would have, Kael said. The document wasn't secret. It would have been known to the major ruling houses. His voice was carefully, precisely controlled. If she understood what it meant, she would have understood that the bond would give the bonded pair consolidated power over both realms, power that would make her own position redundant. So she split us apart, Lyora said. She took my memory, she took your sight, she arranged a marriage between you and her daughter to keep herself in proximity to the power she couldn't destroy, and sent riders to ensure you didn't reach me before the wedding could be finalized. 11 days, Lyora said. 11 days, he confirmed. They looked at each other across the library table, the blind king and the woman with no past, and the weight of what had just been assembled between them sat in the air like the pressure before a storm. I need to ask you something, Kael said, and I need you to answer honestly. I have been. I know. He paused. Are you afraid? She thought about it. The real answer, not the performed one. Not of her, she said finally. I'm afraid of what I don't know yet. Of the parts I can't remember. She stopped. The full moon is in 6 days. He understood what she meant without her explaining it, which told her something about how much he already knew or suspected. His expression didn't change, but something in it deepened. 6 days, he said. Whatever is trying to wake up in me, she said carefully. It's going to wake up. I can feel it. And I don't know what happens when it does. And I don't know if I'll be a danger to— You won't be, he said, with a certainty that had no basis she could identify other than bone-deep conviction. You don't know that? No, he agreed, but I know what the prophecy said about the white wolf. A pause. It said she protects what is hers. What is hers? The phrase sat in her chest like an ember. She was still turning it over when the door to the library opened without a knock, and Aldrich came in fast. The particular speed of a man carrying urgent information and not wasting time on preamble. My lord, he said, I apologize. There's a situation in the east courtyard. He glanced at Leora. Back to Kael. The man we captured on the ridge. He's been found. Found, Kael said. Dead, my lord. The guards found him 20 minutes ago. Cell door locked. No evidence of entry. Aldrich's voice was flat with the deliberate flatness of someone relaying information they don't want to have. There's a message. Left on the body. A silence. For me? Kyle said. Aldrich glanced at Leora again. For her, he said. Quote. The message was a single line written in black ink on white cloth, and Leora read it in the courtyard beside the dead man's cell, in the cold torchlight, with Kael standing at her shoulder and Aldrich and 2 guards at a distance that was close enough to respond and far enough to pretend they weren't watching. The line was, The girl you are looking for died in a burning village 5 years ago. Come home, little ghost, or prove me right. No signature. No signature was necessary. Leora stood in the cold and looked at the words and felt something happen inside her that was not fear and not anger, but some third thing, older than either. A recognition, vast and cold as the mountain above them, that whoever she had been before the cabin and the tea and the 5 blank years, that person had been someone worth erasing, which meant that person had been someone worth becoming. She folded the cloth, put it in her pocket, turned to look at Kael's profile in the torchlight, the strong jaw, the sightless eyes, the absolute stillness of a man who is not waiting to see what she does because he already knows. 6 days, she said. 6 days, he agreed. And above them, the mountain held the cold, and the stars were very far away, and 11 days to the south, a delegation was preparing to travel north, carrying with it the careful architecture of a woman who had spent 5 years believing she had won. She had not won. She had only delayed. And somewhere deep in Leora's chest, in the place where a white wolf had been sleeping for 5 years, something opened one eye. The next 3 days were a siege by other means. Leora recognized the pattern because she had lived inside a version of it for 5 years, the slow, methodical application of pressure designed not to break something outright, but to erode it. In the Ashwood, it had been isolation, fog, and routine. Here it was subtler and therefore more sophisticated. The meals that arrived wrong, too cold, too late, once with something dissolved in the water that she smelled before she drank. The advisors who materialized in corridors to ask questions that weren't questions. The guards whose shifts changed so that the faces outside her door were always unfamiliar. The whispers she could hear. And now that the tea was 5 days gone, she could hear them clearly through stone walls, which was itself information, running through the servant passages like water finding its level. Nobody woman, forest girl, nobody. She heard the word often. It had been applied to her with Derek's voice for 5 years. It landed differently here, with more witnesses, more weight, in a place where nobody carried actual institutional meaning. In a fortress built on bloodlines and history and the kind of identity that came with documents and witnesses and land, being nobody was not just an insult. It was a structural disqualification. She let them talk. She spent the 3 days mapping the fortress with the methodical focus of someone who understands that geography is survival. She walked every corridor she had access to, memorized every staircase and exit, noted every guard rotation. She visited the stables and reacquainted herself with Stone, who had been brought up from the camp and installed in the Dravenhold stables, and who turned to her immediately when she entered with the same purposeful recognition he'd had in the Ashwood lean-to. She spent time in the lower library when Kyle wasn't using it, reading everything she could find about the Northern Realm's history, the ruling lineages, the border territories, the war records. She was looking for a name she'd find before she died if it was there. She was looking for herself. On the fourth day, she found something. It was a genealogical record in the third volume of a history of the border provinces. Dry, administrative, the kind of document written for completeness rather than interest. She almost missed it, but the name caught her. Vale, listed as the noble family of the eastern border province of Alderath, and beside it, in the careful notation of a court historian, House Vale, extinguished following the siege and fire of Alderath Keep, year 412. Surviving members, none confirmed. Year 412, 5 years ago. She sat with the book in the library light and turned the page and found the supplementary note, added in a different hand, more recent ink, slightly different script. Inquiries regarding a surviving member of House Vale, minor female, have been formally closed following confirmation of death. Inquiry closed by order of Queen Morvana of the Southern Reaches on behalf of her investigation into border stability. Closed by order of Morvana. Inquiry closed. Her hands were steady. The thing in her chest was very, very awake. She had a house. She had a name. She had a keep that had been burned. Burned, the dream images, the firelit hall, the man's laughing face. And a family that had been declared extinguished by the same woman who had then paid to keep her in a fog for 5 years, to make sure that if she somehow wasn't dead, she would at least be useless. House Vale, extinguished. Morvana had written that, about her own house, about her father. She closed the book. She set it back on the shelf with precise hands. She walked out of the library and into the corridor, and she didn't walk to her own rooms. She walked to the war room, where Aldrich had told her Kyle could be found in the afternoons, and she pushed the door open without knocking. The war room was large and cold, with maps covering every wall. Territorial, military, strategic. Kyle was at the central table with Aldrich and 2 other officers, and all of them looked up when she entered, and the quality of their attention varied. Aldrich's was cautious, the officers dismissive. Kyle's was exact. Pinned on her with the accuracy she'd stopped finding surprising. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "We're in the middle of—" One of the officers started. "5 minutes," Kyle said. Not to her, to the room. Aldrich and the officers left with the professional smoothness of people who have learned not to make the exit look like what it is. The door closed. She told him what she'd found. Quickly, cleanly, without dramatics. The genealogy, the fire, the notation. Morvana's formal closure of the inquiry into survivors. When she finished, Kyle was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. "Alderath," he said. "I know that province. The eastern border. It was held for 2 centuries by the Vale line. They were considerable." He paused. "When the keep burned, I was told it was an internal conflict, a dispute over succession. Morvana sent formal condolences." "She burned it," Leora said. Not a question. "Almost certainly." His voice was iron quiet. "If she knew about the prophecy, if she knew what a Vale alliance with Dravenhold would mean for her position—" "She killed my father," Leora said. The words sat between them. She had known it, on some level, since the moment she found the record. But saying it aloud made it architectural, something load-bearing in the construction of the next thing she decided to do. "Leora," Kyle said, and her name in his mouth was a different thing than it had been in anyone else's. More weight to it, more. She didn't have a word for it. Recognition, residence. "The moon is in 2 days," she said, "and Seraphine arrives in 7, and I don't have time to grieve this properly yet, so I'm going to put it somewhere and deal with it later." She looked at him. "I need to know that when it happens, when the moon does whatever it does to me, I need to know that you're not going to let them lock me in my room or decide I'm dangerous, and No one is locking you anywhere, he said. Your counselors have a different opinion. My counselor's opinions, he said very precisely, do not supersede mine in this fortress. He came around the table, and she had the vertiginous experience again of him moving toward her in the sightless way he had, not reaching, not tentative, walking directly to where she was, as if he had always known. He stopped close enough that she could see the scar at the edge of his jaw, the texture of the wolf head pin at his collar. Whatever happens in 2 days, he said, I will be there. You can't see, she said. I don't need to see. Something in his expression shifted, not soft, but open, which was a different thing, and in a man like Cale Draven, a considerably rarer thing. I can feel where you are. I have been able to since the moment I caught you on that ridge. He paused. I told you something was taken from me 5 years ago. I could feel the absence of it every day. He stopped. I can feel you the way I used to feel that absence. Except what? Except it doesn't feel like absence, he said. It feels like the opposite. The war room was cold. The maps on the walls showed every border and boundary and strategic consideration in the northern realms, all the geography of power and claim and contested ground. Leora stood in the middle of it and felt, moving through her from the base of her spine to the top of her skull, the slow, unstoppable rising of something that had been sleeping for 5 years and was waking up now, whether she was ready or not. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he said. Outside in the servants' passages, the whispers ran on, and in the east courtyard the dead man's cell sat empty, and somewhere to the south a queen was moving pieces across a board she thought she controlled. And in the war room of Dravenhold, the wolf in Leora's chest opened both eyes and stretched its enormous white shoulders, and waited. The day before the full moon, Dravenhold got a visitor nobody expected. She arrived at the gates in the early afternoon on a horse that cost more than most men earned in a decade, accompanied by a retinue of 8, not the 11 days Veth had projected, but 7, because Queen Morvena of the Southern Reaches did not apparently wait for schedules when something had disrupted her plans. And something had. Leora could see it in the posture of the woman who rode through the gates of Dravenhold like she owned the foundation stones. The particular rigidity of someone performing composure while running calculations at speed. Leora watched from the east wing window as the retinue crossed the courtyard below. Lady Seraphine came first, young, perhaps 20, with her mother's coloring and none of her mother's stillness. She moved with the bright surface-level energy of someone who had been prepared for this visit and was performing their preparation. Beautiful in the deliberate way of people who have been told since childhood that beauty is a tool and have learned to keep it sharp. She looked around the courtyard with the quick cataloging eyes of someone assessing a new territory. Her eyes did not come to the east wing window. Her mother's did. Queen Morvena was perhaps 55, and she was not what Leora had imagined, which disturbed her more than the expected version would have. She had imagined someone visibly terrible, someone whose face wore what they'd done. Instead, a handsome woman in dark traveling clothes, gray-streaked hair immaculately dressed, with a face that was composed and careful and absolutely comprehensively intelligent. She rode into the courtyard of a fortress she'd spent 5 years working to control by proxy, and she looked up, just once, briefly, at the east wing, and her eyes found Leora's window with the precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. For 3 seconds, across the cold courtyard air, they looked at each other. Morvena's expression didn't change. Then she looked away and dismounted and began greeting the assembled court with the warmth of a woman who had no doubts about her welcome. Leora stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something complicated. Not fear, but the physiological cousin of it, the body's recognition of a real threat. She pressed both hands flat against the wall and breathed through it, slow and deliberate, the way she'd learned to breathe through the full moon aches in the cabin. The thing in her chest was not quiet. It had been escalating all day, the way pressure escalates in a sealed container, steady, relentless, the physics of something that cannot stay contained. 1 day early. Morvena had come 1 day early, which meant the full moon was tomorrow night, and Morvena would be inside the fortress walls when it happened, and the thing Leora had been treating as a private reckoning between herself and her own biology was suddenly a tactical situation. She needed to find Kael. Now. She didn't find Kael. Kael found her, appearing in the East Wing corridor with Aldrich at his shoulder and the specific tension of someone who had received multiple pieces of bad news in rapid succession and was organizing his response. "You saw," he said. "I saw." "She came early. I was not informed of the schedule change." Something in the line of his jaw. "Which means the information was deliberately withheld from my messengers." "Or your messenger was intercepted," Aldrich said quietly. Kael's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere around him did. A slight, barely perceptible lowering in temperature that had nothing to do with the stone walls. "She'll want an audience tonight," Leora said. "She'll want to see me." "She'll want to assess you," Kael said. "Determine how much you know, whether you're a problem she can manage here or one she needs to." He stopped. "Eliminate," Leora said. "You can say it. I've been thinking it since I saw her face in the courtyard." "She won't move against you openly," Aldrich said, with the careful certainty of someone who has spent years reading political threat. "Not with the alliance still unsigned. She needs Lord Kael cooperative, which means she can't—" "She killed an entire household to get here," Leora said. "My household. And she kept me in a fog for 5 years, and she had a man killed in a locked cell without leaving evidence." She looked at Aldrich steadily. "She will do whatever she calculates she can survive doing. Don't underestimate her based on what she needs from Kael. She'll decide what she needs, and then she'll decide what she can afford." A silence. "She's right," Kael said. Aldrich let out a slow breath. "Then what do we do?" "The moon is tomorrow night," Leora said. "Whatever happens then, I need to be outside the walls, in the open. I don't know what the transformation does. I don't know what I become or how much control I have, but I know that if I'm inside stone walls when it happens and I can't—" She stopped. Tried again. "If I can't hold it, I don't want to be in a corridor full of—" "I understand," Kael said. He said it without hesitation or qualification, and the absence of both hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. "There's more," she said. "The records I found, the Veil genealogy. If Morvena knows I've found them, she won't wait for the moon. She'll move tonight, before I have whatever advantage the moon gives me." "Then we need to move first," Kael said. "Move how?" Aldrich said. "She's arrived with a retinue. She's a sitting queen. The alliance," Kael said, "was built on the premise that I was forming a union with a neighboring power. Not that I was delivering myself into the management of a woman who murdered my—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and devastating, there and gone. "Who murdered a ruling house and arranged a sustained magical assault on this fortress?" The word magical sat in the air like a blade just drawn. "You can't prove that," Aldrich said, carefully. Not won't, but can't, which was, Leora noted, its own kind of loyalty. He wasn't arguing against the truth. He was mapping the territory of what could be demonstrated. "Not yet," Kael said, "but the sorceress who cast the curse will be found." He turned his blind gaze toward Leora. "There is a woman. She lives in the high passes, 3 hours north of here. She's known to the Dravenhold records as a practitioner of old blood magic, the kind that can bind and unbind things that conventional force cannot touch." He paused. "If a curse was laid on both of us simultaneously, it would have required blood magic of that scale. The practitioner who cast it would still carry the signature of it. The magic would still be traceable." "You want to bring a sorceress into this," Aldrich said. "I want to break a curse," Kael said. "Tonight, if possible. Before Morvena has time to do anything that requires a response, I'm not prepared to give within fortress walls in front of witnesses." He turned back to Leora. "But it requires you to leave the fortress tonight, ride north with me, find the woman, and return before dawn." "Tonight," Leora said. "Morvena will request an audience this evening. I'll give her one. Delay it as long as protocol allows. 2 hours, perhaps 3. She won't expect me to be absent because I am never absent from Dravenhold during a political visit. It's one of the things she's calculated on." Something that was almost a grim form of satisfaction moved through his expression. I don't tend to behave unpredictably. It's considered one of my better qualities. And one of your exploitable ones, Leora said. Yes. He said it without defensiveness. Morvena has had 5 years to study me through Seraphine's courtship negotiations. She knows my patterns. She doesn't know you. He paused. She doesn't know what we know together. Leora looked at him in the corridor light, the blind king with his wolf head pin and his absolute certainty, and thought about the message left on the dead man's body. Come home, little ghost, or prove me right. I'm not a ghost, she said. No, he agreed. You're not. When do we leave? 2 hours. After the welcoming meal begins, when Morvena's attention is occupied and she believes me present in the hall. He paused. Can you ride in the dark? I rode for 5 days from the Ashwood, she said. I can ride in the dark. Not. The welcoming meal for Queen Morvena and Lady Seraphine was held in the Great Hall, and Leora attended the first portion of it because Kael had said it would look worse for her to absent herself entirely than to appear briefly and leave, and because she wanted, with a cold, specific clarity that surprised her, to see Morvena at close range. She had expected it to feel like confronting a monster. It felt, instead, like watching a performance. Morvena at the table was magnificent in the way that very controlled people are magnificent. Every word calibrated, every smile deployed with surgical precision, every piece of attention given or withheld as a deliberate act. She was charming to Kael's officers, gracious to Counselor Veth, warm with her daughter, and when she turned to Leora, as she did, inevitably, within the first half hour, with the naturalness of someone who had rehearsed the movement, she was courteous in the exact way that rendered courtesy a weapon. Leora Val, she said, as if tasting the name. We understand you arrived under rather dramatic circumstances. Somewhat, Leora said. The Ashwood forests. Morvena's eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of things that have no warmth but excellent visibility. A long way from anywhere, that region. It must have been a difficult journey. Very, Leora said. And you have no family? No connections to follow up with? So no one who might be looking for you? The question was light as feathers and loaded as a cocked crossbow. I had a family, Leora said, a long time ago. She looked at Morvena steadily. I'm still working out what happened to them. The pale gray eyes didn't flicker. Not a tremor, not a tensing, nothing. The performance was extraordinary. If Leora hadn't known, she wouldn't have seen anything at all. But she knew. And so she saw the thing that only someone looking for it would find. The single, involuntary expansion of Morvena's pupils, black swallowing gray for one fractional second. Recognition, calculation, decision. I hope you find your answers, Morvena said warmly. I intend to, Leora said. She excused herself from the meal 40 minutes later, citing her injury, and Kael, across the hall, his blind face turned with that uncanny accuracy toward her, gave no visible sign of acknowledgement. But as she passed his chair, his hand was resting on the table, and his fingers moved once, 3 taps against the wood, a signal she didn't have a code for but understood anyway, the way she was beginning to understand him. I know, I'm coming, go, she went. The northern pass in full dark was a different landscape than the one she'd ridden through 2 days earlier. Stripped of its daytime definition, reduced to shapes and sounds, and the cold that hit the exposed face like a considered insult. Kael rode at her side with 2 of his most trusted guards, men named Bryn and Court, who had the quiet competence of people who had been in difficult places before and didn't make noise about it. Stone had been resaddled without comment by Corin the stable hand, who had looked at Leora with the wide, loyal eyes of someone who had decided, at some point during her 3 days in the fortress, that she was his project. She had ridden hard terrain before. She had not ridden it in the Greymaw Mountains in darkness, at speed alongside a man who navigated by means she still hadn't fully catalogued. Kael rode the pass with Stone's confidence and more. Not just memory of terrain, but something active, something that processed the darkness and rendered it usable. At one point she heard him say quietly, to Bryn, Ice on the left shoulder of the path, 20 feet. And when they reached that point, there was ice, precisely where he'd said. How? She asked, once they were past it. I hear the difference in the wind, he said. Cold surfaces change the sound slightly. Ice, especially. A pause. You get better at it. 5 years is a long time. You never tried to fix it, she said. Not accusatory, just observation. I had it investigated. 3 separate physicians, 2 scholars of old blood magic. None of them found a cause they could treat. His voice was even. After the 2nd year, I stopped looking. It wasn't useful. Useful, she said. Spending resources on the unfixable is indulgent, he said. I had a territory to run. She looked at his profile in the darkness, the precise, spare face of a man who had made peace with something catastrophic and turned it into a strategy. You thought it was permanent, she said. Yes. Were you afraid? The mountain wind moved through the pause. I was angry, he said, for about 6 months. Then I was practical. Another pause. Fear requires believing things can get worse. By the time I'd accepted the blindness, I had established that the floor was the floor, and standing on the floor is more productive than being afraid of it. That's the most functional and depressing thing I've ever heard. Something moved through his expression that was unmistakably the suppressed architecture of a smile. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. I know. She looked at the road ahead, at the mountain shapes against the slightly lighter sky of full overcast, and thought, one more day. One day until the floor dropped away and she found out how deep the new one was. The sorceress's name was Marin, and she lived in a stone structure built into the face of the mountain that looked, from a distance, like a natural formation, and revealed itself as habitation only when you were close enough to see the thin line of smoke rising from a seam in the rock. She was waiting at the entrance when they arrived, which told Leora either that she'd been watched on the approach or that Marin had other methods of anticipating visitors. She was old, the compressed, dense kind of old that suggested the aging process had decided to become efficient, with white hair and the dark, comprehensive eyes of someone to whom other people are frequently less complicated than they think they are. She looked at Kael with the familiarity of prior acquaintance. She looked at Leora with something else, a long, still, careful attention, as if she were reading something written in a language most people had forgotten. Come in, she said. Not surprised, not performing unsurprise, simply not surprised. Inside was warm, the compressed warmth of a small space with a good fire, and ordered in the particular way of someone whose organization system was internal and consistent even if it was incomprehensible to others. Bundles of dried material hanging from the low ceiling, shelves of vessels, a table with 2 chairs and a working surface covered in things Leora couldn't name. You knew we were coming, Kael said. I knew someone was eventually coming, Marin said. She settled into her chair with the ease of someone for whom the world generally arrives to find her already seated. The bond has been degrading for 5 years. The moon is tomorrow. I assumed someone would realize. Tell me what you know about the curse, Kael said. Marin looked at him, looked at Leora, looked at them together with an expression that held, briefly, something Leora couldn't categorize. Not pity, not satisfaction, something in between. The look of someone watching a thing arrive at its natural destination after a very long detour. Sit down, she said. Both of you. This is going to take a moment. What she told them was this. The curse had been cast 5 years ago, on the night that Alderath Keep burned. It was blood magic of the highest order, not just difficult but genuinely rare, the kind that required both a practitioner of considerable skill and a sacrifice of equivalent weight. It had 2 components, wound together the way vines grow through a fence until fence and vine become structural to each other. The first component had been cast on Leora. It locked her memory, suppressed her nature, and made her body reject its own transformation. That was what the tea compounded. The blood moss and the second ingredient, which was a specific magical suppressant designed to work in concert with the curse rather than independently. Without both together, the curse degraded. Had degraded, in fact, over 5 years. Slower without the tea, faster now. Tomorrow night's full moon would break the remaining bonds entirely. The second component had been cast on Kael. Not blindness, precisely, but a severing. The prophecy bond between them was the source of both their abilities, her transformation, his sight beyond sight. When the bond was severed, both went dark. His eyes stopped processing. Her wolf stopped breathing. The curse was designed to degrade naturally, Marin said. Whichever practitioner cast it was constrained. Blood magic of that potency leaves traces that can be found and followed. They couldn't make it permanent without making it detectable. So they made it lasting enough to accomplish the goal, keep the bond severed until the political alliance was formalized. Once Morvena's daughter was married to the Draven line and the power arrangement was legally cemented, a degraded bond was manageable. A full bond would not be. Seraphine, Kael said. Seraphine was always a bridge, Marin said, not the destination. Morvena's goal was never the marriage. It was the access the marriage would provide. A Draven-aligned southern queen with direct proximity to the northern realm's power for generations. She paused. The bond breaking would give you both power consolidated enough to make her position untenable. Who cast it? Leora said. A woman named Thessaly, Marin said. She was the court sorceress of the southern reaches. Old family, considerable skill, and considerably more debt than a woman in her position should have. Her mouth was thin. Morvena paid it, all of it, in exchange for the most complex working in 3 centuries of blood magic. Where is she now? Kael said. Here, Marin said. In the mountains. Has been for 4 years. She came to me because she was ill. The backlash of a working that large never leaves the practitioner entirely. She's been... Marin paused. Managing. She's here, Leora said. Right now. In the back room, Marin said. She's been conscious of what's coming. She's been... I think the word is ready. She looked at Leora. She wants to tell you something. The back room was small and smelled of sickness and pine resin, and the woman in the bed was perhaps 60 and looked older, with the specific hollowness of someone who has been ill for a long time and has reached an accommodation with it. She looked at Leora when she came in, and her eyes were clear, the particular clarity of someone who has used up all available energy on anything except honesty. Leora Vale, she said. Her voice was thin but steady. I know your face. I have known it for 5 years. She paused. I saw your father before the keep burned. He knew what was coming. He had enough time to... He sent you away. You were 17 and sleeping, and he put you on a horse and sent you north, and you didn't know because you were asleep, and Derek was the man he paid to take you far enough that the fire wouldn't find you. The room went very quiet. Derek wasn't Morvena's man originally, Leora said slowly. No, he was your father's man, for about 6 months. Thessaly's hands moved on the blanket. Morvena found him. She found him, and she told him what you were and what she would do to him if he didn't cooperate, and he chose to cooperate. He wasn't... She stopped. He wasn't a good man, but he wasn't the architect of it. My father, Leora said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, compressed, controlled, covering something enormous. He sent me away. He saved you, Thessaly said. He knew about the prophecy. He knew what the bond meant. For both realms, for you. He knew Morvena would come for him, so he got you out first. She coughed, breathed. He burned the keep himself, destroyed the records that could be used to trace you. The fire was his, not hers. She arrived and found it already burning, and she let people believe it was hers because it served her purpose, but... Another pause. He chose the fire. He chose it so she couldn't use what was inside it against you. Leora stood in the small back room and looked at the woman who had stolen 5 years of her life and felt something happen in her chest that had nothing to do with the wolf. A human thing, sharp and terrible and laced with a grief so large she understood immediately why she'd need to put it somewhere and deal with it later. Her father had saved her. Her father had burned his own home to protect her. Her father had died believing she was alive in the north somewhere, running. She was running. She'd made it. I need your testimony, Leora said. Her voice was very even. I need you to say all of this in front of witnesses, in front of Kael's council, in front of Morvena. Thessaly looked at her. I know, she said. That's why I'm still alive. A pause. I've been waiting for you to come find me. They rode back through the mountain dark with Thessaly wrapped in a traveling blanket and secured in the saddle behind Bryn, who bore this development with the silent professionalism of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what a day in Kyle Draven's service produced. Marin had given Thessaly something for the journey, a preparation that would hold the illness at bay for 24 hours, long enough to speak, long enough for testimony. After that was Thessaly's problem, and Marin had said this without cruelty, but with the directness of someone who understood that some debts are paid in specific currency, and Thessaly had known the terms. It was past the deep middle of the night when they came back through Dravenhold's gates. The fortress was quiet, or appeared to be, but as they crossed the courtyard, Leora registered several things at once. The quality of the light in the east wing was wrong, the guard rotation had changed again, and two of the men near the inner gatehouse had the posture of people doing something other than their stated function. Morvena's people. Inside the walls. The east wing, she said quietly. Kyle had already stilled on his horse. Bryn, he said, equally quietly, take Thessaly to the lower library. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except Aldrich. Court. Find Aldrich. Now. Both men moved without acknowledgement, which was its own kind of discipline. She went through my rooms, Leora said. Not a question. She would have needed to know what you'd found, Kael said. The Vale genealogy. Whether you'd connected it to her. He was already dismounting, fluid and silent. She'll know you found it, which means she's past the calculation stage. She'll move tonight. Yes. Then so will we. Leora dismounted. Something was happening in her body. The ache in her chest was no longer directional and patient. It was immediate and rising, the way heat rises, the way fire climbs. She pressed a hand to her sternum, and beneath her palm she felt, physically and unmistakably, something change. A loosening. As if a knot that had been pulled tight for 5 years had been touched, finally, by someone with warm hands. Leora. Kael's hand found her arm in the dark, unerringly. What's happening? The moon, she said. Her voice was steady. Her whole body was not. It's not tomorrow. It's now. I can feel it. The moon doesn't rise for hours yet. I know, but... She stopped. She looked at her hands. In the thin light of the courtyard torches, the mark on her wrist was glowing. Not brightly, not visibly from a distance, but phosphorescent, the pale light of something that carries its own luminosity. The curse is breaking, she said. Thessaly's confession, the act of it, bringing her here, naming it aloud. It started... The working unravels from the moment of confession, Kael said, and his voice had changed, tight and urgent. Marin told us that. The confession is part of the unraveling mechanism, which means we have until it finishes to get Thessaly in front of the council, Leora said. Because when the transformation happens, anything she says will be challenged as coerced or fabricated. We need the testimony on record before... The arrow came from the eastern battlement. She heard it before she saw it, the particular whisper of a loosed shaft. And she moved without thinking, the movement not planned but enacted by something that had been making decisions in her body without consulting the rest of her for some years. And she grabbed Kael's shoulder and pulled him left, and the arrow hit the stone wall 2 feet from where he'd been standing. The courtyard erupted. Bryn and Court, still in the courtyard, she realized, hadn't made it to cover yet, were moving toward them, drawing weapons. Guards were shouting, torches lurched as men ran, and from the eastern battlement 2 more shapes were moving, not archers this time, coming down the internal stairs, and these men had the cloak and movement of professional assassins, not castle guards. Morvena's people, already inside. Get to the great hall, Kael said. His voice had gone to cold iron. The council chamber opens off it. If we can get Thessaly in front of... She's not here yet, Leora said. Bryn took her to the library. Then we go to the library and we... The second arrow came from behind them this time, from the lower battlements, And Leora spun, and the ache in her chest became, for one shattering second, a detonation, a wave of heat and pressure and light that moved outward from her sternum to her extremities, and the mark on her wrist blazed white, and the arrow stopped in the air 3 feet from Kael's back. Stopped. In the air. And fell. A silence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Kael's head had turned toward her. "What?" said Bryn flatly from somewhere behind them. "Was that?" Leora looked at her own hands. The mark on her wrist was still glowing, brighter now, steady as a lamp. She could feel the warmth of it, the deep structural warmth of something waking up in her bones. And she thought very clearly, tomorrow was always a lie. The moon has nothing to do with schedules. It has to do with this, with Thessaly's confession and Kael's hand on her arm in the dark and the arrow aimed at his back. It has to do with what is mine. "We need to move," she said. Kael reached for her hand. His fingers found hers in the dark. Not tentative, not searching, direct, and closed around them. And where they touched, the mark on her wrist pulsed once, strong and even. And in the darkness of the fortress courtyard, she saw him blink. Blink and frown slightly. And then look. Actually look. With his gray eyes, in the specific, reactive way of a person seeing light they weren't expecting. At the glow on her wrist. "Kael?" she said. "I see it," he said, and his voice was something she'd never heard in it before. Something that had no tactical application and no structural function and was entirely, helplessly human. "I can see the light." From above them, on the eastern battlement, another shape appeared, and then another, and another. A spreading movement of dark-clad figures that told her the scale of what Morvena had placed inside these walls was not 2 assassins, not 4, but something considerably more organized, something planned in advance, something that had been biding inside Dravenhold for days, waiting for the signal. "She didn't come for the wedding," Leora said, looking up at the battlement. The mark on her wrist was blazing now, and the heat in her chest was a tide, and she could feel, like standing at the edge of an enormous wave, the transformation waiting behind the last thin membrane of the curse. She came to finish it. She came here to make sure we never— "Leora." Kael's hand tightened on hers. She looked at him. His eyes, his gray, blind, 5-year dark eyes, were moving, tracking, finding her face in the torchlight with the slow, overwhelming deliberateness of something that has been denied for a very long time, and is now refusing to be denied any longer. "Run," he said. Not a retreat, not a surrender. The specific command of a man who has calculated an outcome and is giving the person he trusts most the role that only they can fill. "Get to the forest, the northern tree line. Get away from the stone walls. I'm not leaving you. I'm not asking you to leave me. I'm asking you to get to open ground." His voice was raw and precise and certain as the mountain under them. "The wolf can't wake in a courtyard, you know that. The forest, Leora." He was right. She knew he was right. The wave building in her was enormous, and it needed space. It needed the sky and the cold and the dark ground. And if it crested inside the fortress walls with assassins on every parapet— "Find Thessaly," she said. "Get her to the council. I know," he said. "Kael, I know," he said again and released her hand. She ran through the small northern gate that she had memorized on her second day because Petra had told her to know the exits. Out onto the ridge path, down the slope, into the dark. The cold hit her like a physical thing, and she ran through it toward the tree line, toward the deep dark of the mountain forest, and behind her she could hear the fortress erupting, shouting, metal, the organized chaos of a fortress under internal assault. And in her chest, the last thin membrane of 5 years of careful captivity pulled taut, and the tree line. She reached it and plunged into the dark between the first trees, and the cold closed around her and she stopped, because she couldn't run any farther, because the wave had crested, because there was nothing left holding it. She looked up through the branches at the sky. The moon was exactly where it had been yesterday. Ordinary, patient, the same moon it always was. The light didn't matter. She understood that now. The moon had never been the cause. It had been the signal, the time of the month, when the curse degraded just enough that the wolf scratched at the door and she felt it. But tonight the door was already open, had been opened by a woman's deathbed confession and a man's hand in the dark and an arrow that had stopped in the air because something in her had decided, without consulting anyone, that Kyle Draven was hers to protect. She protects what is hers. Leora Vale stood in the forest and tilted her head back and felt 5 years of fog and silence and deliberate nobodiness dissolve. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once, the way ice doesn't melt in winter but shatters in spring. And she remembered. She remembered the fire-lit hall. She remembered her father's face, strong and laughing, and at the end terribly frightened but steady. She remembered running barefoot across cold stone, not afraid, fast. She remembered the first time she'd felt the wolf, not as a stranger, not as something caged, but as herself, the truest self, the one that ran at night in the forests around Aldoreth Keep when she was small and the world was large and nothing had come yet to make it small. She remembered her name, not Leora Vale, not only that, the full name, the ruling name, the name that matched the mark on her wrist and the record in the genealogy and the reason a queen had spent 5 years and considerable resources trying to make her into nobody. She opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not human. It was enormous and white, and it rose through the trees and hit the mountain and came back. And in the fortress above the tree line, she knew without seeing it that every person in the courtyard heard it. Every guard, every soldier, every dark-cloaked figure on the battlements, and stopped. And in a chamber somewhere in the fortress, she knew without seeing it that a blind king turned his face toward the sound, and that in his gray eyes, for the first time in 5 years, the darkness was no longer absolute. The wolf stood in the mountain forest, white as snow, vast as memory, and looked up at the fortress on the rock above her, and began to run. The white wolf hit the fortress wall at the place where the northern gate stood open and did not slow down. She had never run as a wolf before, so had no memory of it, no practiced navigation of this body's geometry, and yet the body knew. It had always known. It had been knowing for 22 years, contained and suppressed and carefully denied, and now it was doing what it had been designed to do, which was move through difficult terrain at speed with a precision that the human body, for all its intelligence, simply could not match. The gate arch was narrow. She cleared it with an inch on either side and did not scrape stone. The cobblestones of the courtyard were ice-slicked and treacherous for anything on 2 legs. She crossed them at a dead run, and her paws found every safe surface instinctively, the distributed weight and the low center and the 4-point contact of a body built for exactly this. The courtyard was chaos. She processed it in the 3 seconds of her crossing. Kael's guards in a defensive cluster near the Great Hall entrance, outnumbered but holding. Dark-cloaked figures, she counted 9, 10, 12, moving with the coordinated efficiency of trained operatives. Bryn down on one knee with blood on his face but still swinging, Court holding the door. 2 bodies on the cobblestones that she didn't look at long enough to identify. And Kael. Kael was at the center of it, which was where she'd known he'd be, because Kael Draven was not a man who moved to the edges of things. He was fighting with the fluid, controlled precision of someone who has developed a comprehensive relationship with his other senses, tracking opponents by sound and air displacement and the vibration of footsteps through the stone, responding to threat before it completed its arc. He was outnumbered 3-1 and was not losing, but he was not winning either, and the 4th man coming at his back from the right was coming from an angle that his hearing couldn't. She was between them before she decided to move. The 4th man hit the cobblestones hard. She didn't kill him. She put him down with the specific force of something demonstrating capability rather than deploying it. A controlled impact that said, "Stay down," in a language that required no translation. He stayed down. The courtyard went still, not completely still. The sounds of struggle continued at the periphery, but the center stilled the way a storm stills in its eye, and every face in the space turned toward the white wolf standing between Kael and the fallen man. The torchlight caught the fur and made it glow, not the mark's phosphorescence, which was still present on the corresponding place on her foreleg, but the natural cold luminosity of white and firelight, vast and strange, and nothing like anything the people in this courtyard had expected to see tonight. Kyle turned toward her. His face was cut above one eye, and he was breathing hard, and his sword was still raised, and he turned toward her with his gray eyes and looked, with an acuity that was not yet full sight but was not 5-year blindness either, something in between, something returning, at the white wolf standing next to him. "There you are," he said. Not surprised, not afraid, not performing steadiness for the benefit of the watching courtyard, simply recognizing. She pressed her shoulder against his leg, one pulse of warmth between them, the bond completing a circuit it had been broken in for 5 years, and she felt it like a key finding a lock, the specific, irreversible click of something restored. His hand came down and rested briefly on the top of her head. "We have a problem," he said, and his voice was back to operational, the cold, organizing voice of a man running a calculation. "Thessaly is in the library with Bryn. The council hasn't assembled, and Morvena is in the Great Hall with 6 of her retinue, and I would estimate an awareness that her operation has just encountered a significant variable." The wolf turned her head toward the Great Hall doors. "I know," Kael said, "but we need witnesses. We need the council in that hall before—" She was already moving toward the hall. "You go in there," he finished, to the space where she'd been. Done. The transformation back was harder than the transformation out. Not painful, or not only painful, but resistant, the way a door resists closing when the frame has swollen with damp. The wolf did not want to be small again. The wolf had been small for 5 years under a different name and in a different cage, and it had opinions about returning to the compressed, limited architecture of the human body. She stood in the shadow of the Great Hall's exterior wall and fought it, not against the wolf, but with it, negotiating, which was a strange and intimate process that she suspected would become easier with practice and was emphatically not easy now. She came back to herself in stages, crouching against cold stone, breathing through the reconstruction of her own edges. And she was human again and shaking slightly, and her shoulder wound had reopened, and she did not care even a little, because she was also, for the first time in 5 years, entirely and completely herself, and self was worth the price of a shoulder wound. She pulled herself upright. Her clothes were not destroyed, which she suspected had something to do with the nature of the change and would be another thing to understand later. Torn in places. Adequate for the immediate purpose. She opened the side door to the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Dravenhold was built for exactly one thing, the formal exercise of authority. High ceilings, stone floors, the long council table at the far end where, on significant occasions, the fortress's governing council assembled to witness decisions of permanent consequence. It was not a comfortable room. It had been designed by people who believed that comfort was the enemy of clarity, and that the architecture of power should make its expectations legible. Morvena was standing at the center of it when Leora walked in. She had arrayed herself with the instinctive authority of someone who understands space as a political instrument, positioned so that every entrance to the room placed her at the observer's focal point, backed by 2 of her retinue and Lady Seraphine, who stood to her right with the confused, frightened expression of a young woman who had come on a political visit and found herself inside something she hadn't been told about. The remaining 4 members of Morvena's retinue were not in the hall, which meant they were elsewhere in the fortress, and the calculation of where elsewhere was sat at the back of Leora's mind like a coal. 6 of Kael's council members had arrived, summoned by Aldrich, she presumed, who was standing near the council table with the expression of someone maintaining composure through sheer force of professional obligation. Councillor Veth was among them, and when Leora walked through the side door, Veth's eyes moved over her with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a woman updating a complex model in real time. Morvena looked at Leora, then at the state of her clothing, then at the mark on her wrist, which was still faintly glowing, fading now as the bond settled but not gone. Something moved behind the pale gray eyes. "You should be dead," Morvena said. She said it quietly, without inflection, the way you say a thing you had relied upon as a structural truth and have just discovered is not. It was the most unguarded sentence she had produced since entering the fortress, and the room heard it, and the room's temperature changed. "I know," Leora said. "You've made considerable effort toward that end." She came fully into the hall, closed the door behind her. "It hasn't worked." This is, Morvena reset visibly, pulling the composure back over her expression like drawing a curtain. When she spoke again, her voice was the public one, measured, gracious, faintly concerned. This woman arrived at Dravenhold 5 days ago with no verifiable identity, no history, no— "Her name is Leora Val," said a voice from the main doors. Cale walked in. He walked in with the blood still on his face and his sword sheathed and his gray eyes moving. Still not fully, still not with the complete restored range of before, but tracking, adjusting, finding shapes and faces with the tentative, growing certainty of a sense returning to use. He walked to the center of the hall and stopped, and the room organized itself around him the way it always did. Not from fear, Leora had come to understand, but from the specific gravity of someone who has decided what they are going to do and done it every single day without deviation for 9 years, until the doing of it had become load-bearing in the architecture of everything around them. "Lady Seraphine," he said. He turned his face toward the young woman, and his expression was careful, not unkind. The care of someone who is about to do something difficult to someone who doesn't entirely deserve it. "I owe you honesty before anything else. What your mother arranged. I will not hold it against you, but I cannot proceed with what was planned. I need you to understand that." Seraphine's mouth opened, closed. She looked at her mother. Morvena's face was stone. "Lord Cale," she said, the warmth entirely gone now, replaced by something harder and more honest, and, because of that, more dangerous. "Whatever this woman has told you, the council will hear testimony," Kyle said. He looked at Aldrich. "Now." Aldrich opened the far door. Bryn came through it, and behind him, walking with the careful gait of someone managing pain they've agreed to defer, was Thessaly. The room saw her, and the room changed again. Veth's expression sharpened to something Leora couldn't read. 2 of the other council members exchanged a look that had the weight of recognition. And Morvena looked at Thessaly with the single, devastating, full-body stillness of someone who has just watched their last contingency fail. "The council's assembled," Kyle said. "Thessaly will speak. Every member of this council will hear her testimony in full. After which—" He turned, and his eyes found Leora with the directness of the bond, the connection that didn't need complete sight to function. "Leora Vale of House Vale will present the documentary evidence found in this fortress's own records." He paused. "And then this council will make a determination." "This is irregular," one of the council members said, a heavy man named Osric, who had the expression of someone who had aligned himself carefully with the expected future and was now watching the expected future change shape. "A formal accusation against a sitting queen requires—" "I know what it requires," Kyle said. "I have assembled it. Sit down, Osric." Osric sat down. Thessaly was given a chair because she needed one, and she sat in it with the compressed dignity of someone who has made peace with how they are seen, and she spoke. She told it the way she'd told it to Leora in the mountain room, but fuller, more specific, more detailed, the practitioner's account of what had been done and how and at whose instruction and for what compensation. She described the components of the curse. She described the night at Alderath when it had been cast. She described the blood sacrifice, which made the room go very quiet, the specific quiet of people hearing something they will not be able to unhear, and the mechanism that had bound Kyle's sight and Leora's memory together in a single severing. She said Morvena's name 11 times, and each time she said it, the name landed in the room differently, heavier, freighted with what had preceded it. When she finished, the silence lasted for a count of perhaps 15 seconds, which is a very long time in a stone hall full of people absorbing the restructuring of everything they thought they knew. Morvena spoke into the silence. "She is a sick woman," she said. "A known practitioner of illegal blood magic, dying of the backlash of her own workings. Her testimony is corroborated," Leora said. She laid the genealogical record on the council table. The history volume opened to the supplementary note, the notation of Morvena's formal closure of the inquiry into Vale survivors. She laid them side by side with the care of someone who has spent 5 days preparing for exactly this and has made no errors. "The fortress's own records," she said, "written in the hand of Dravenhold's court historian. Queen Morvena's formal signature on the closure notice 6 weeks after Alderath burned. She looked at Veth. You have the original signature documents from the alliance negotiations. The handwriting is verifiable. Veth looked at the documents on the table, at Leora, at Kael. I'll need to examine them, she said. Of course, Leora said. This is fabricated, Morvena said, and her voice had lost, finally, the last layer of social performance. What was underneath was harder and colder and more honest, and the room heard the honesty of it and flinched. This woman has no legal standing in this fortress or any other. She has no witnesses to her claimed identity, no living family to corroborate. She has me, Kael said. Simple. Absolute. 3 words that restructured the entire geometry of the room. Morvena looked at him. She has the bond mark, which matches the Draven sigil recorded in this fortress's founding documents, he continued. She has the prophetic record, which this council can access in the lower archives. It has been there for 40 years. She has the testimony of a practitioner naming you by name and describing the working in terms that are technically specific enough to be verifiable by any qualified scholar of blood magic. He paused. And she has the documented evidence that you personally closed an inquiry into Vale survivors. An inquiry you had no legal jurisdiction to close, since Alderath was not in your territory. He let that sit for a moment. Tell me, Counselor Veth, what would you call the closing of an inquiry into a potential surviving heir by a foreign queen with political interests in that heir's non-existence? Veth was quiet for a moment. Obstruction, she said, at minimum. She looked at the documents again. At maximum, conspiracy to suppress rightful claim. To suppress a ruling claim, Aldrich said from the side of the room. He had the look of someone who has been doing arithmetic since Thessaly started speaking and has arrived at a number that surprises even him. Alderath's ruling house, which would be, if a surviving heir were confirmed, the eastern border province reverts to the surviving heir, said the council member next to Veth, a small, precise woman named Dara, who specialized in territorial law and who had the expression of someone encountering a genuinely interesting legal puzzle. Standard succession law, unchanged for 200 years. She looked at Leora. If you are Leora Vale of House Vale, and if testimony and documentation support that identity, then Alderath is yours. Has been yours since the night the keep burned, legally speaking. Nothing that occurred afterward changes the succession. Nothing that occurred afterward, Morvena said, and the control was gone entirely now. The voice beneath the voice, finally, fully present. You are proposing to restore a nobody from a dead house based on a dying woman's fever speech and a document that any forger could— My sight is returning, Kael said. The hall went silent. He let the silence work. Whatever was done to me 5 years ago is being undone, he said. I can see light and shape. I could see the glow of the bond mark in the courtyard tonight. My physicians will document the change, and any practitioner of blood magic consulted will confirm that the restoration of a severed bond has the precise physiological signature that Thessaly described. He paused. The working is unraveling. It has been since the night Leora arrived at this fortress, which is corroboration of a different kind. Not documentary, not testimonial, but physical, happening in this body, publicly. He let that settle. You cannot argue with my own sight returning, Morvena. Lady Seraphine made a sound. It was small, barely audible, and it was not anger or calculation. It was the sound of a young woman who has loved her mother all her life, discovering something about her mother that she cannot integrate into that love. She was looking at Morvena with an expression that Leora recognized from the inside, the specific disorientation of realizing that the person who built your entire understanding of the world has been doing so with intentions other than your welfare. Morvena looked at her daughter. Something crossed her face, the first real thing Leora had seen on it, not performed, not calculated. Just a mother looking at her daughter's expression and understanding what she had done and knowing precisely that it cannot be undone. It lasted 1 second. Then the mask came back. Seraphine, Morvena said, say nothing. Mother says, say nothing. Her voice was sharp and Seraphine flinched, and Morvena straightened and turned to the council with the gathered authority of someone who has not yet decided they have lost. This council has no jurisdiction over a sitting queen. Whatever accusations are leveled, the proper venue is an international tribunal, not a domestic council in a northern fortress. Any determination made here is legally void, and— Sit down, Kael said. The room held its breath. Morvena did not sit. You have no authority to— I have authority in this hall, Kael said, because this is my hall, and you are in it, and you sent 12 armed men into my fortress tonight to kill a woman under my protection, and you ordered at least one arrow aimed at my back. Those are not the actions of a diplomatic guest. They are the actions of an invader. He turned his face toward her, and his gray eyes, still incomplete but returning, looked at her with something that cut the room. Sit down, or I will have you escorted to the east cells, and we will sort the question of jurisdiction in the morning. A silence that lasted a very long time. Morvena sat. It was not a defeat. Leora could see that clearly, could see the calculation still running behind the pale gray eyes, the continued assessment of angles and options, and the distance to the doors. She was not broken. She was regrouping. But she sat, and the sitting was its own information, broadcast to every person in the hall. The queen had calculated and concluded that the most viable path forward required her compliance, for now, and that compliance was the loudest acknowledgement she was capable of giving that the ground had shifted. Veth was already bent over the documents with the focused attention of someone doing work that matters. Dara had moved to stand beside her, the two of them murmuring in the low, specific register of people conducting analysis. The other council members had arranged themselves in the distributed, alert posture of people who have understood that something historic is happening in their presence and are adjusting their positioning accordingly. Leora stood at the table and looked at the documents. Her house's name, her father's implicit signature in the absence of his survival, the careful, deliberate erasure of herself from the record, and felt the grief she'd put aside 3 hours ago make another, quieter bid for her attention. She acknowledged it. Let it sit there. Later. Veth, Kyle said. How long for verification? Veth looked up. The handwriting comparison? An hour, perhaps 2. The succession documents are in the lower archive. Dara will need to retrieve them. The prophetic record is— She paused. I know where it is. I've known where it was for 11 years. She said this with the flat honesty of someone making a disclosure they should have made earlier. I chose not to surface it because the alliance seemed— She stopped, looked at Leora, at the mark on her wrist, at Kyle's face. I was wrong, she said. No qualification, no cushioning. I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of the night correcting it. It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was action. Thank you, Leora said. Veth looked at her for a moment. My Lord Vale, she said. The title landed in the hall like a stone into still water, small, precise, permanent. Kael's head turned. Aldrich's eyes moved between Leora and the council, and in the chair where Morvena sat, the pale gray eyes registered the words and the weight of them and went very still. My Lord Vale, a territorial address, a legal designation. Coming from Councillor Veth, the woman who managed every legal and administrative instrument of this fortress, a woman who did not produce titles she didn't believe she was obligated to give. Leora Vale, Lord Vale, heir of Alderath, surviving member of a house that a queen had spent 5 years in considerable blood declaring extinct. Not extinct, present. Standing in a stone hall in the northern mountains with her shoulder wound bleeding through her torn shirt and the bond mark glowing on her wrist, and the grief set carefully aside for later, and the wolf settled in her chest like a banked fire. Warm, certain, enormous, and hers. She looked at Kael. He had turned toward her the way he turned toward her, that precise, bond-guided orientation that didn't need functional sight, though the sight was coming back, light and shape already, and more by the hour. He was looking at her with the gray eyes, and the cut above his eye, and the blood-streaked face, and the expression of a man who has been standing on a floor he thought was permanent, and has just felt it become something richer and more complex than floor. Thessaly needs a physician, she said. She held herself together for the testimony. She won't hold much longer. Petra's on her way, Aldrich said. The Eastern Battlement Guards. Secured, Bryn said from the doorway, where he had appeared with the dried blood still on his face and the air of a man who has accomplished several things and has a report ready. 11 of the 12 are in custody. One managed to make it over the wall, courts tracking him. He paused. 3 of them are talking, already. They'll give her name, Morvena said from her chair. Everyone looked at her. She looked back with the gray eyes and the gathered composure and the specific expression of someone who has run every remaining calculation and arrived at a decision. They'll give my name, she said, and they'll give the names of others, people in this council, in northern households, in the border territories. People I've been cultivating for years in preparation for a consolidation that... She stopped. Something moved across her face that was possibly the most honest thing she had ever produced in public, a kind of exhausted acknowledgement. There are names you'll want, information about the network. What I've built, it extends further than what happened 5 years ago. She looked at Kael. I will provide that information, all of it, in exchange for a formal process rather than this. Her gesture encompassed the hall, the documents, the assembled council. I want a proper tribunal, international adjudication, not a summary judgment in a fortress. The hall was very quiet. Why? Kael said. Because a summary judgment can be challenged, contested, overturned by the right political pressure in 10 years, 15. A properly convened tribunal cannot. She looked at him, and there was something in it that was the closest she would probably ever get to respect. Clear-eyed, unsentimental, professional. I have spent 20 years building the thing I've built. If it ends, I want it to end on terms that don't leave doors open for someone to rebuild it under my name. She paused. I want it finished, not martyred. Lady Seraphine had been very still for several minutes, looking at her hands. She looked up. I'll testify, she said. Her voice was quiet and very even. Whatever I know, whatever she told me, the things I didn't understand the significance of. I'll testify. Morvena looked at her daughter. Seraphine, don't, Seraphine said, just that. One word, and something closed in her expression that Leora recognized from the inside. The specific, necessary closing of a door that will hurt to keep shut but must be kept shut anyway. Don't tell me to say nothing again. The silence after that had a different quality than all the previous silences. Kael turned toward Veth. Convene the full council at dawn. Whatever documentation can be prepared tonight, I want it ready. Thessaly's testimony transcribed and signed, he paused. And I want 2 riders sent to the eastern border before sunrise, to Alderath. Alderath? Dara said. There's nothing in Alderath. The keep has been a ruin for... There will be something in Alderath, Kael said, because the Lady of Alderath is going to need to assess her territory. He turned toward Leora without being told where she was. If you'll consent to being assessed. I've been assessed continuously for 5 days, Leora said. I'm developing an opinion about it. An unfavorable one, I imagine. Deeply. Something crossed his face. That suppressed structural thing that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same family. Then I'll limit it to the legally necessary minimum. I'd appreciate that. Veth was already moving, directing 2 of the other council members toward the archive stairs, issuing instructions in the quiet, precise voice of someone who has shifted from resistance to momentum and is now running at full capacity. Aldrich had gone to manage the prisoner's situation. Bryn had disappeared back toward the courtyard. The hall was reorganizing itself. The specific reorganization of a space where the power arrangement has changed, and the people inside it are updating their positions accordingly, some with relief, some with calculation, 1 or 2 with the shell-shocked quality of people who had thought they knew what today was going to be. Morvena sat in her chair and did not move and did not speak, and the 2 guards Kael had placed on either side of her were unnecessary, and they all knew it. She was done moving. She had made her calculation, and her calculation had in the end come down to what she'd told Kael. She wanted it finished properly. She had built something that had required considerable intelligence and sustained effort and complete ruthlessness. And she was, in her way, Leora thought, a professional about it. Professionals do not burn down their own work without purpose. The grief would come later, the full weight of it, her father, the keep, the 5 years, the things that would never be recovered. She could feel it waiting with the patience of something that knows it will not be indefinitely denied, and she respected it enough to let it wait. She walked to the window of the great hall, high, north-facing, looking out over the valley and the dark shapes of the mountains above the tree line. The forest was dark and still. The wolf was still in her, settled, present, no longer a stranger. More like a second pulse, more like the part of herself that ran at night across cold stone when she was small and the world hadn't yet learned to make her small. She heard Kael before she heard his footsteps. The bond made her aware of his approach, the way you're aware of a fire in a cold room without looking for it. He stopped beside her at the window. She looked at his face in profile. The cut above his eye had been cleaned at some point. Petra's work, probably, quick and efficient in passing. His gray eyes were looking at the window, at the mountain shapes, at the actual, physical, visually processed world, in the imperfect, recovering, incrementally returning way of a sense that is not fully restored, but is undeniably, measurably coming back. "What can you see?" she asked. "Shapes," he said, "light and dark. Your face is—" He stopped. "The outline of it. The specific—" He stopped again, and she understood that he was dealing with something he didn't have a fully operational vocabulary for yet, because the vocabulary for things you've lost and found again is never quite adequate. "I know what you look like," he said finally. "From the bond. I've known for days. But seeing it is—" A pause. "Different. Better or worse than expected?" "Better," he said without hesitation. She looked back out the window. "My father burned his own house to get me out," she said. Kael was quiet. "I keep putting that away to deal with later," she said. "But it keeps—" She stopped. "He died thinking I was alive in the north somewhere. He was right." She pressed her palm flat against the stone of the window frame, cold, solid, real. "I want to go to Alderath. I know it's a ruin. I know there's nothing there. I still want to go." "You'll go," Kael said. "Simple. Not a promise of assistance, just a recognition of inevitability. When this is processed and the tribunal is arranged and the council has what it needs." He paused. "I'll come with you, if you want." She didn't answer immediately. The question, the offer, with its particular weight of the thing that had been building between them since a ridge path and a caught fall, sat in the cold air between them, and she let it sit there, feeling its dimensions. "Yes," she said. Below them, in the courtyard, torches moved as guards completed their sweeps. In the council chamber off the hall, Veth was already at work. She could hear the specific sound of someone who has decided on a course and is executing it with everything they have. In the east cells, 11 dark-cloaked operatives were discovering the particular acoustics of being in custody. And in a chair in the great hall behind them, a queen sat with the stillness of someone who had lost the board but retained the intelligence that had built it, and was already, Leora had no doubt, beginning to think about how the next thing would go. Not over then. Not yet. But the ground had shifted, and the shift was real, and Counselor Veth had called her My Lord Vale in a room full of witnesses, and the mark on her wrist had stopped glowing because it no longer needed to announce itself. It was simply there, as it had always been, patient and certain, and built into the architecture of who she was. The wolf in her chest breathed evenly. Outside, the dark of the Greymaw Mountains pressed cold and close against the fortress walls, and the night had more hours in it yet, and the morning was going to require everything she had. She was ready. For the first time in 5 years, she was entirely, completely ready. The morning came slowly to the Greymaw Mountains, the way mornings do in high country, not a sunrise so much as a gradual, reluctant concession of the dark, gray light leaching down from the peaks and filling the valley by degrees until the world was visible again, cold and clear and unambiguous. Leora had not slept. She didn't think anyone in Dravenhold had slept. The fortress had been in motion all night. Veth and Dara in the archives, Aldrich managing the custody situation, Petra moving between the infirmary and Thessaly's room, the council members arriving and departing from the chamber in the rotating rhythm of people assembling something that needed to be right before it could be called done. She had stayed near the great hall, available when needed, not inserting herself where she wasn't, conserving the energy that the transformation and the fight and the hours of sustained tension had drawn down to something closer to empty than she wanted to acknowledge. Kale had been in and out, the specific constant motion of a man running a territory that had just experienced an internal assault and required his attention in 8 directions simultaneously. He moved through the fortress with something new in him. Not the 5-year calibrated navigation of a blind man who had mastered his condition, but the emerging, slightly uncertain range of someone whose primary sense was returning in stages and had not yet fully reconciled with the compensatory systems built around its absence. She watched him pause sometimes, just briefly, a half-second recalibration, when his eyes gave him information that his other senses hadn't anticipated. The adjustment. The integration. He was seeing more by the hour. Corin, the stable hand, had appeared at some point before dawn with food she hadn't asked for. Bread, hard cheese, something hot in a clay cup that was neither tea nor the breakfast drinks she associated with Dravenhold's usual offerings. And she had accepted it without ceremony and eaten all of it without tasting most of it, because she was running on the cold, steady fuel of necessity, and the body had opinions about what it needed that she was not in a position to argue with. At first light, Veth came to find her. "It's ready," Veth said. She looked like someone who had worked through the night on something important and had no interest in discussing the physical cost of that. The documentation, the handwriting comparison is complete. The signature on the inquiry closure matches Morvena's authenticated signatures from the alliance negotiations at 3 independent points. Dara pulled the succession documents. The prophetic record is on the table. She paused. It names the bond. By sigil. The sigil on your wrist. And his. She paused again as if running a final internal check on what she was about to say. There is no reasonable legal interpretation of the assembled evidence that does not confirm your identity and your claim. "Is the council assembled?" Leora said. "Full council. All 9 members." Veth looked at her steadily. "Including Osric, who has recalibrated his position overnight. People often do when they can see which way the tide is going." "Yes," Veth said without apology for it. "That's how councils function. The important thing is where they stand when the determination is made, not where they stood at midnight." She paused. "And where they stand now is clear." Leora followed her to the council chamber. The council chamber was smaller than the Great Hall and had none of the Great Hall's architectural ambition. It was a working room. A long table, 9 chairs on one side for the council, a single chair on the other side for whoever the council was addressing, high windows that let in cold northern light without warmth or drama. It was the room where things were made official, and its plainness was deliberate. No theater, just the machinery of governance doing its work. All 9 council members were present. Kyle stood at the end of the table, not seated, which was his right as lord of the fortress, with Aldrich beside him. The documents were laid out in order: genealogy, signature comparison, succession law, the prophetic record open to the relevant passage. Thessaly's testimony had been transcribed through the night, and the transcript sat in Petra's careful hand at the near end of the table. Morvena was present as well, not at the table, but against the far wall with 2 guards and Aldrich's personal attention, which she bore with the compressed dignity of someone who had decided how they were going to conduct themselves and was conducting themselves that way regardless of the circumstances. Seraphine sat apart from her mother, near the door, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had not slept and had used the sleepless hours to restructure something fundamental. Leora took the chair across the table from the council. She sat in it the way she had learned to do most things in the past week, not with performance, not with a rehearsed version of what the situation required, but simply by deciding what was true and letting the body express it. She was Leora Vale. She was the Lord of Alderath, which was a ruin on the eastern border that she had never seen conscious and waking, but which was hers by every law that governed the territories these 9 people had spent their careers administering. She had been nobody for 5 years. She was nobody no longer, and she didn't need the council's determination to make that true. She needed it to make it usable, which was a different thing and a necessary one. Veth conducted the proceeding with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for it in their mind all night and was now executing without deviation. She presented each piece of evidence in sequence, allowed the counsel to examine and question, answered the questions that were hers to answer, and directed others to Dara or to the documents themselves. The process took the better part of 2 hours, and it was thorough, not perfunctory, not reaching for the conclusion, but working toward it with the integrity of people who understood that a determination made carelessly was a determination that could be undone. Osric asked several questions that were pointed enough to be honest rather than obstructive, which Leora gave him credit for. Dara walked the counsel through the succession law with the patient precision of someone who loves the work and is not going to let urgency make it sloppy. And through it all, Morvena sat against the far wall and said nothing, which was, in its own way, the loudest thing she could have done. When Veth finally set down her last document and looked at the counsel and said, "The chair will hear any final questions before the determination," the room was quiet, with the particular quiet of 9 people who have arrived somewhere and know it. No final questions. Veth looked down the table, up the table, at Leora. The Council of Dravenhold, sitting in formal session under the authority of Lord Kael Draven, finds as follows, she said. The documentary and testimonial evidence presented this morning establishes, to the legal standard required under territorial succession law, the identity of the individual known as Leora Vale as the surviving heir of House Vale of Alderath, Eastern Border Province. The house is not extinct. The claim is valid. The succession is unbroken. She paused. The council so determines. 8 voices said affirmed in sequence around the table. Osric was the last. He said it with the specific weight of someone who considered the word carefully before producing it and means it when he does. Affirmed, said Osric. The word sat in the cold morning light of the council chamber, and the room absorbed it, and the world on the other side of the determination was different from the world on this side of it in all the ways that matter and some ways that would take years to fully map. Leora breathed. Then she looked at Morvena. Morvena was looking back, the pale gray eyes, the composed face, the queen who had built 20 years of careful architecture on the premise that a girl in an Ashwood cabin would never remember what she was. The architecture had not survived contact with the girl remembering. The tribunal, Leora said, not to the council, to Morvena directly. You asked for a formal international tribunal, a proper process. I did, Morvena said, and you'll give full testimony, the network, the names, everything you said. Everything, Morvena said. She said it like a woman honoring a contract, which was, Leora understood, the only kind of honoring she was likely to get from this woman, and was worth more than it would be from most people for exactly that reason. Then you'll have your tribunal, Leora said, because a summary judgment is not what this is. She looked at the council, at Kael, back at Morvena. A summary judgment is what you would have given me if the positions were reversed. That's not how I intend to operate. Something moved through Morvena's expression. Small. Brief. Possibly, in some other life, the beginning of a different kind of respect. Then it was gone, and she was the composed queen again, waiting for what came next. The riders went out before noon, 6 of them, to 6 different destinations, the eastern border, the 3 major northern households, the neutral international tribunal seat at the city of Varen, and one to the southern reaches, bearing a sealed communication from Kael Draven to the governing council there that advised them of the situation and requested they hold the Queen's administrative functions in abeyance, pending tribunal proceedings. Aldrich had drafted it in the night. Kael had signed it at dawn. It was the kind of letter that does not ask permission, and it was sent by a man who had 9 years of established authority and a reputation for meaning what he wrote. The internal situation was processed with the same methodical efficiency. The 11 captured operatives were formally charged and secured. The one who had gone over the wall was found by court mid-morning, half frozen in a snow gully 2 miles from the fortress, and brought back in a condition that Petra described as manageable in the tone of someone applying that word generously. Morvena's retinue, the 6 who had remained legitimate guests through the night, who were either genuinely uninvolved or very convincingly performing uninvolvement, were questioned individually by Aldrich and released with formal notification that they were subjects of the tribunal's interest. Seraphine asked to speak to Leora in the afternoon. They met in one of the East Wing sitting rooms, not Lyora's quarters, neutral ground, and Seraphine came in with the controlled composure of someone who had decided how this conversation would go and was marshaling everything she had to ensure it did. She was, Leora noticed in the full daylight, younger looking than she'd seemed in the great hall the night before. The brightness she'd arrived with, the performing preparedness quality, was gone, and what was underneath it was simply a young woman who was 20 years old and had just found out that the ground under everything she knew was not what it had appeared to be. "I didn't know," Seraphine said, not as an apology, as information delivered with the directness of someone who has decided that the only thing left of value is accuracy. "The marriage, I knew it was political. I knew my mother wanted it. I didn't know—" She stopped. "I didn't know what it was built on. What she did." "I believe you," Leora said. She meant it. She had watched Seraphine's face in the hall when Thessaly spoke, and the expression on it had not been the expression of someone hearing information managed into a usable story. It had been the expression of someone being hit. "I should have asked more questions," Seraphine said. "Probably," Leora said, "but asking questions of your mother about her methods, when her methods are what they are, that's easier to see from outside than inside." Seraphine looked at her hands. "What happens to me?" "The tribunal will determine what you knew and when. If your testimony is honest and your involvement was as limited as I believe it was, you'll have a position to argue." She paused. "The southern reaches need governance. You're 20 years old and you have more information about your mother's network than anyone except Morvina herself. If you use that well and honestly—" She stopped. "I can't promise you anything. I'm not the tribunal." "No," Seraphine said. She looked up. "But you're the person my mother was most afraid of. And you're not—" She hesitated. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted to hurt her back." She said it simply. "Someone as ruthless as she was." "The tribunal can be ruthless on my behalf," Leora said. "I don't need to be." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "The king," she said. "He was always—" She stopped, chose different words. "He was always honest with me in the negotiations. He was courteous and fair, and he never—" She stopped again. "He never looked at me the way he looks at you." The room was quiet. "I'm sorry," Leora said, and meant it, for the specific thing she was sorry for. Not everything, but the specific, real thing. The collision between this young woman's genuine experience and the architecture built around it. "Don't be," Seraphine said. "I'd rather know." She stood, smoothed her dress with a gesture that was half habit and half the reassembling of composure. "I'll testify. Everything I know, honestly. Not because it helps you. I mean, it will, but that's not—" She paused. "Because it's what's accurate. And I think I've been surrounded by inaccuracy long enough." She left, and Leora sat with the quiet for a moment and thought about the ways that the people who get caught in the machinery of other people's plans are not always the villains, even when they're on the wrong side of things, and how that was worth remembering when the power was yours and the machinery was yours to run. 3 days after the council determination, Thessaly died. Petra had known it was coming, had said so privately to Leora on the second day, with the clinical compassion of someone who has learned to be honest about these things because false hope is its own kind of cruelty. The backlash of the working had been in her for 4 years, and the act of the confession had not accelerated it precisely, but finalized something, as if the last purpose had been served and the body had simply stopped arguing. Petra sat with her. Leora came in the last hour and sat on the other side of the bed and held the woman's hand, which was something she couldn't have explained the logic of but didn't feel the need to. Thessaly had been a weapon pointed at her. She had also been a woman who chose, in the end, to put it down. Those two things were both true, and they didn't cancel each other out, and the hand in hers was a human hand, cooling by degrees, and she held it until it was still. She went to the East Wing afterward and sat by herself for a long time. The grief she had been deferring found her there. Not all of it. You can't process 5 years of deliberate erasure in one sitting in a stone room in the cold, but enough. The specific private grief of a father she barely remembered and would never be able to ask. The keep she hadn't known to miss. The years of fog and careful nobodiness. The 17-year-old girl who had woken up in a rotting cabin and been told she was nothing and had, for 5 years, done her best to build something out of the nothing she'd been given, not knowing she was building on stolen ground. The 17-year-old girl had not been nobody. She had been someone's daughter, someone's heir, someone's bonded, the subject of a prophecy and a crime, and a sustained and costly effort to keep her from becoming what she was. She had become it anyway. She cried for a while, which was necessary and not something she needed anyone for. Then she washed her face, braided her hair back with hands that didn't shake, stood at the window and looked north at the mountains until she felt the wolf settle in her chest like a hearth fire finding its rhythm, warm and even and permanent. Then she went to find Kael. He was in the lower library. He was often in the library in the afternoons now, she had come to understand, but for different reasons than before. Before, she suspected, it had been the one space where the tactile reading system and his cultivated other senses gave him the same access to information as a sighted man, and he had valued it for the equity. Now he went because he was, she was discovering, genuinely voracious about information, and the returning sight meant he was rereading things he'd read by touch for 5 years and finding them different on the page. He knew she'd been crying before she crossed the threshold. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the slight shift in his posture that was attentiveness without intrusion. "Thessaly," he said. "Yes." She came in and sat in the chair across the table from him. "She's gone." He closed the book in front of him, said nothing for a moment, which was the right response. "I didn't feel what I expected to feel," she said. "I thought I would feel angrier about what she did, but she chose to confess. She held herself together for the testimony when she didn't have to. She could have died quietly in Marin's back room and never said a word. She looked at her hands. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Kael said. "Some things are just what they are, complicated and real and not resolvable into something simpler." "The floor is the floor," she said lightly. Something crossed his face. "I said that, didn't I?" It was either functional or depressing. I couldn't decide. "It was both," he said. "Most true things are." She looked at him across the table. The face she knew now in the way you know a face you've been looking at for a week under varying conditions of crisis and clarity and cold and firelight, the scar at his jaw, the gray eyes that were seeing her more completely by the day. The person underneath the authority, who was, she had found, exactly as complex and direct and unsentimental and unexpectedly, occasionally, warm as the combination of those qualities implied. She thought about the ride through the mountain dark to Marin's house, about the way he'd known where the ice was on the path, about him saying, "There you are in a courtyard," while she was still white-furred and enormous, and none of that had been strange to him at all. "Your sight," she said. "How much?" "Colors this morning," he said. "For the first time since—" He stopped, looked at her directly, with the gray eyes that were tracking her face with the conscious, deliberate attention of someone learning a language they once knew fluently. "Red is different than I remembered." "How?" "More." He paused. "Everything is more than I remembered." He looked at her for another moment. "Your hair is darker than I thought." "Your room is very well lit," she said. "I've been adjusting things," he agreed. She almost smiled, didn't quite. "You're going to be insufferable when it's fully back." "I have always been insufferable," he said, without any indication that he found this troubling. "The sight is unrelated." This time she did smile, and he saw it. She could tell by the way his expression shifted, that small structural change there and present and unguarded for one moment before the natural containment reasserted itself. She looked down at the mark on her wrist, pale, permanent, utterly itself. "I want to go to Alderath," she said. "I know we said when the tribunal is arranged, but I want to go before, soon." She paused. "I need to see it, whatever is left of it. I need to stand on the ground and—" She stopped. "I need to close something." 5 days, Kael said. "The tribunal correspondence will be sent. The council needs 3 more days to complete the formal documentation, and I need 2 days to— 5 days, she said. 5 days, he confirmed, and I meant what I said. I'll come. You have a territory to run. I'll run it from the saddle for a week, he said. Aldrich has managed without me before. A pause. He'll manage again. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The thing between them, the bond, the prophecy, the week of crisis, and cold, and shared information, and the specific, undeniable gravity of two people who have been designed for each other by something older than either of them, sat in the library light between them, warm and enormous and patient. Neither of them reached for it in that moment. It didn't need reaching. It was simply there, the way the mark was simply there, permanent, inherent, not requiring announcement. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. The tribunal conveners from Varen arrived on the 8th day, which was faster than expected, and said something about what Kael's letter had communicated about the urgency and the weight of the situation. There were 3 of them, senior adjudicators with the careful neutrality of people whose professional value is their impartiality and who guard it accordingly. They reviewed the documentation, interviewed Thessaly's transcribed testimony, conducted preliminary interviews with Morvena and Seraphine and the 11 captured operatives and 4 of the council members, and issued a formal finding within 48 hours that the matter was substantive enough to proceed to full tribunal proceedings to be held at Varen in 30 days. Morvena received the news with the composure of someone who had been expecting it and had already moved to the next calculation. She was transferred to formal tribunal custody with a courtesy that was, given everything, more than she had extended to others, which Leora had decided was simply how she intended to operate and was not looking for acknowledgement of. The morning they left for Alderath, Leora, Kael, Bryn, Court, and Aldrich, who had announced his intention to accompany them with the decisive finality of someone who has weighed the argument against it and found it insufficient, the fortress came out. Not formally, not in the organized ceremony of a lord's departure. But the courtyard was not empty when they came down, and the people in it, guards, attendants, stable hands, kitchen staff, council members who had presumably coincidentally found reasons to be in the courtyard at this specific time, watched with an attention that was not ceremonial. It was the attention of people who have absorbed something about what has happened in their fortress over the past 8 days and have arrived at their own positions about it. Corin had saddled Stone, who stood in the morning light with the patient authority of a horse who has been through enough to have opinions and has decided this particular morning is a good one. When Leora came to him, he pressed his nose briefly against her shoulder, a greeting that was also a demand, and she gave him the apple she had been carrying in her pocket precisely because she had learned in 5 days what he expected. She swung up into the saddle. She looked down at the courtyard. Veth was standing near the gate, and when their eyes met, the counselor inclined her head. Not a bow, not the performance of deference, but the specific voluntary acknowledgement of a professional who has updated her position and means the update. Leora returned the nod. Kael mounted beside her, and his gray eyes swept the courtyard with the still returning, still marveling quality of someone for whom the ordinary visual world continues to be a daily source of, not wonder exactly, but something in that region. He looked at the fortress walls, at the sky, which was white with high cloud and very cold and very clear, at her. Ready? He said. I've been ready for 5 years, she said. I just didn't know it. They rode out through the gates. Alderath was 4 days east at a measured pace, which they did not keep because neither of them was good at measured paces, and Bryn and Court adapted without complaint, and Aldrich muttered about supply calculations with the dedication of a man who complains about everything and abandons nothing. The landscape changed as they moved east, the high mountain cold gradually softening into the different cold of plateau country, the black granite giving way to limestone, and then, eventually, to the brown gold of grassland frozen under late-season frost. The sky got bigger. The wind changed direction. And on the morning of the 4th day, coming over a rise in the road, Leora saw the eastern border province of Alderath spread out below them in the gray morning light. Wide, flat-bottomed valley, a river running silver through it, the ruins of a keep on the high ground at the valley's eastern edge. She stopped stone on the rise. The others stopped around her. Nobody said anything. The keep had burned thoroughly. You could see that from the rise, the way a fire that has been complete leaves a different kind of ruin than one that was only partial. The outer walls still stood. The towers had partially collapsed. The interior structures were gone, replaced by the dense, low growth that fills in over years. Scrub and winter-gray grasses and the skeletal shapes of small trees that had seated themselves in the ash-enriched soil. It was a ruin, and it was hers, and she had never seen it conscious and waking, and her father had died in it, so she didn't have to. She rode down. She rode across the valley floor in the cold morning, stones steady under her, and she didn't speak, and no one asked her to. She came through what had been the gate. The threshold was still there, the arch still standing, more solid than most of the rest. And she rode through it into the interior of the keep. She stopped in the center of what had been the great hall. The walls around her were the height of her shoulder. The fire had taken everything above. The sky was directly overhead, winter white and enormous, and the cold was sharp and absolute, and the silence of the valley pressed in from all sides, the silence of a place that has been waiting. She dismounted. She stood on the ground, the actual physical ground of her house, her inherited claim, the place her father had burned so she could live. And she put her boots in the frost-white grass, and she stood there, just stood, for a long time. The wolf was very still inside her, not absent, never absent, but still in the way of something that knows where it is and finds it. Not comfortable, not happy, but right. The right place, the right ground. She heard Kyle dismount behind her. His footsteps crossed the frozen grass and stopped beside her, and he stood beside her in the ruined hall under the open sky, and he looked at what there was to see with the gray eyes that were nearly fully returned now. Nearly a few more days. And he was quiet with her. He chose this, she said finally. Her voice was even and not performing evenness. He could have run. He could have gotten on a horse and gotten out and left the records for Morvana to find. He stayed and burned it himself so she couldn't use it. He knew who you were, Kyle said. What the bond meant. He knew if you survived, you'd find it eventually. You'd find your way back to your own name. He paused. He wasn't wrong. No, she said. He wasn't wrong. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the frozen ground. Cold, solid, real. Under the frost, the earth of Alderath, which had belonged to the Vale line for 200 years and had been called extinct and had turned out to be neither. She stayed like that for a moment. Then she stood. I want to rebuild it, she said. I know. It'll take years. The territory is... I don't even know the state of the villages, the people, the infrastructure. It will take years, he agreed. That's what territory does. She looked at him. You've rebuilt things before. One or two, he said, and the dry, structural, almost smile was present again, the one that was his specific frequency of warmth. I have opinions about load-bearing walls. I bet you do. I also have a master builder, he said, and a resource allocation system that could support a border province restoration in the second cycle, if the northern surplus holds. He paused. And I have a significant personal investment in the success of the heir of Alderath, which I am willing to discuss in detail at a more appropriate moment. She looked at the mark on her wrist, at the matching mark on his, at the ruined walls around them, sky above, ground below, the river in the valley catching the thin winter light. A more appropriate moment, she said. What would that look like? Less rubble, he said. That's a high bar given current circumstances. I'm a patient man. She looked at him for a long moment, in the cold and the ruin and the silence of Alderath, and felt the bond between them. Not the ache it had been for 5 years, not the desperate pull of something trying to close a distance, but the settled, permanent, load-bearing warmth of something that has found its place and knows it. Like the mark, like the wolf, like herself. You're not a patient man, she said. You're a man who decided that being impatient was unproductive and trained himself out of showing it. A pause. That is, he said, an accurate assessment. I've been paying attention. I know, he said. So have I. The river ran silver through the valley below them, and the winter light moved across the frost-white ground, And somewhere in the province of Alderath, the first riders from Dravenhold would arrive in a week with surveyors and supply assessments, and the beginning of something that would take years to become what it was supposed to be. Good things took years. Her father had known that. She was beginning to know it too. But they camped in the valley that night, impractical and cold and entirely worth it, and Aldrich voiced his opinion about sensible accommodation and then organized the camp with the resigned efficiency of a man who voices his opinion once and then does the work anyway, which was, Leora had concluded, Aldrich's fundamental nature and one of his better qualities. The fire was good. The food was functional. The stars over the Alderath Valley were extraordinary. The flat, open sky of plateau country gave them room that the mountain peaks had compressed. And they were brilliant and indifferent and enormous, in the way that stars always are when you're far from stone walls and the space around you has no ceiling. Leora sat by the fire with the wolf quiet in her chest, and the grief mostly processed, or processed enough for now, and thought about 30 days and Varen and a tribunal and the names that Morvena had promised, the network that would need to be untangled, the border territories that would need attention, the eastern province she had just committed to rebuilding from ash. She thought about all of it with the cold, clear engagement of a mind that was no longer running on fog and deliberate suppression, that was operating at full capacity for the first time in 5 years, and found that it was not overwhelming. It was large, extensive, requiring, but not overwhelming, because she had the ground under her and the wolf at her core, and sitting across the fire with Aldrich's muttered supply calculations for background noise, a blind king who had found his sight again by the specific and irreplaceable mechanism of finding her. The tribunal, she said. When it's done, when the determination is final, I want to address the northern households directly, not just through documentation, in person. Kale looked at her across the fire. Why? Because Veth called me my Lord Vale in a room, she said. That's one room. The rest of the North knows me as a nobody who arrived injured in a fortress a week ago. The tribunal's finding will be legal, but legal and known are different things, and I intend to be known. She paused. I intend to be very, very known. Something in his expression shifted. The specific attentive quality that appeared when she said something that aligned with a calculation he'd already made. The spring assembly, he said. It was scheduled before any of this. Every significant northern household sends representation. It's the oldest convening tradition in the Dravenlands. Predates the current borders, predates my family's governance. Every lord and lady of the north. In one place, by tradition. He paused. You could address them there. With you, she said. With me, he agreed. Publicly. That would be the nature of a public address. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire moved between them, and the stars above the Alderath Valley were brilliant and very far away, and completely unconcerned with the politics of the territories beneath them, and the bond between them pulsed once, warm, even, permanent as the mark, and was still. I want to tell you something, she said, that I've been thinking about for several days and keep deciding is either too early or unnecessary to say. Tell me anyway, he said. When I was in the Ashwood, she said, when I was nobody, with the fog and the tea and the cabin, I built things inside it, small, private things. Ways of being a self when being a self was the only territory I had access to. She looked at the fire. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was. But I knew that whatever I wasn't going to be diminished by Derek, by the isolation. I kept building. I kept paying attention. I kept myself sharp even when there was nothing to be sharp for. She paused. I didn't do it for you. I didn't know you existed. I did it because the alternative was becoming nobody for real, and I refused. She looked at him. I just wanted you to know. Whatever the bond means, whatever the prophecy says, who I am is not the product of being bonded to you. Who I am is what I built in a rotting cabin in the Ashwood when I was being told I was nothing. A pause. The bond found someone who was already herself. I want credit for that. The silence was warm. You have it, Kael said, simply, completely, with no qualification. You have all of it." She nodded. "Good," she said. She looked back at the fire, and the night was cold and enormous around them, and the wolf breathed even and warm in her chest, and the stars above Alderath were what they had always been, indifferent and brilliant, and not caring at all what happened below them, which was fine, because what happened below them was the business of the people who lived under them, and she was one of those people, and she had work to do. The spring assembly convened on the first clear day after the last frost, in the great hall of Dravenhold, and every significant northern household sent their lord or their representative, and the hall was full in the way that it was full perhaps twice a decade. Not the managed fullness of diplomatic visits, but the actual, living, organized press of people who had traveled far because the occasion required it. They had heard. Word had moved through the north over the winter with the speed that significant things move when they are also strange. The story of the woman who arrived in the Alpha King's arms, the tribunal at Varin, Morvena's full confession, the network dismantled, Seraphine's honest testimony, the restored heir of Alderath standing in the council chamber with the bond mark on her wrist and 9 voices saying affirmed. They had heard all of it, and the hearing had done what the hearing of significant strange things does. It had made them uncertain, and uncertainty brings people to assemblies. They came to see her. She understood that, and she didn't mind it because she had spent 5 years being invisible and she was not afraid of being seen. She entered the great hall beside Kael, not behind him, beside him, at the same pace, which was itself a statement, and she had intended it as one. She was dressed in the colors of House Vale, which Veth had researched and which turned out to be a deep winter blue that Leora would not have chosen for herself, but had decided to honor anyway, and the bond mark on her wrist was visible above the cuff, and she had made it visible deliberately. She looked at the assembled lords and ladies of the Northern Territories with the direct, comprehensive attention of someone who intends to know this room and everyone in it, and the room looked back at her. She saw the uncertainty, the assessment, the suspended judgment of people who have been told something and are deciding what to do with it in the presence of the something itself. She had been assessed before. She had been the wrong thing in the wrong place before. She had been nobody before. And the specific texture of being regarded as nobody, dismissible, temporary, not worth the full attention of the room, she knew that texture well, and she looked for it in the faces before her and found it in 3, maybe 4. A small number, smaller than she'd expected. The others were different, not convinced necessarily, not all of them, but present, which was different from dismissive, and the distinction mattered. Kael addressed the assembly first, the formal opening, the acknowledgement of the tribunal's proceedings, the legal determination, the documentation. He was precise and thorough and unambiguous, and when he finished, he turned toward her with the gray eyes that were fully, completely restored now, seeing the hall and the people in it with the whole clear range that 5 years of absence had apparently left him hungry for. She stepped forward. She addressed them for a long time, not because she had performances to give, but because she had things to say that were true and that the people in this hall were owed, and she said them plainly and in detail. She told them about Alderath, what had been there, and what had been taken. She told them about the bond and what it meant for both territories, north and south, in terms that were political and practical and not asking for sentiment. She told them what she intended to do: the rebuild, the border province, the eastern territories that had been administratively neglected for 5 years and needed attention, the diplomatic realignment now that the alliance with Morvena's network was dissolved. She did not ask for their approval. She told them what was true and what she intended and what she would need, and she left the door open for questions. There were many questions. She answered them all. The lord of the westernmost northern household, an old man named Tereth, who had not spoken a word through the proceedings and whose silence had weight, stood at the end and said, "You were a nobody a month ago." "I was told I was a nobody," she said. "There's a difference." Tereth looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "there is." He sat. It was not a declaration. It was not a ceremonial endorsement. It was an old man who had spent 60 years doing exactly the thing she had done in the Ashwood, building himself carefully out of the available materials and refusing to be diminished, acknowledging the thing he recognized in someone else. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked out at the rest of the room. The wolf in her chest was still and warm and certain. The ground under her feet was Dravenhold stone, which was not her ground, but her ground was 4 days east, and she would return to it, and return again, and keep returning until the ruins became walls, and the walls became halls, and the halls became the thing her father had believed they would become when he set her on a horse in the dark and told her to go north. He had not been wrong. She was here. She was exactly, precisely, permanently here. Later, after the assembly, after the formal proceedings, after the long, necessary labor of the day was done, Kael found her at the high window of the great hall where she had stood on the night Morvena arrived and watched the queen read her position in the courtyard below. The courtyard was empty now. The valley beyond the walls was dark, and the mountains were darker, and the stars were the same stars they had been over Alderath 4 months ago, brilliant and indifferent and very far away. He stood beside her. She felt him before he arrived, the way she always did. The bond's warmth, the specific gravity of his presence, as familiar now as her own pulse. Tereth's endorsement will carry, he said. I know. The Eastern Border Lords will want a meeting before spring is out. I know. The Alderath survey crew sent their first report. Kael, she said. He stopped. She looked at him. The gray eyes in the hall light, seeing her completely now. The face that had been learning her for 4 months, that knew her in the bond way and the daily way, and the way of two people who have been in difficult places together and found out who each other are in the finding. I know all of that, she said. I'll handle all of that. Can we stand here for a moment? A pause. Yes, he said. They stood at the high window, and the night was cold outside, and the fire behind them was warm, and the mountains held the dark the way mountains do, without effort, without meaning, simply as their nature. She reached out and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, the same way they had in the courtyard the night the arrows came, and the mark blazed and the bond completed its circuit, the same directness, the same absence of uncertainty. I've been thinking about what you said, he said after a while. In the Alderath Valley, about building yourself in the cabin. What about it? I did the same thing, he said. Different materials, different absence, but the same refusal. He paused. I never said that to anyone before. I know, she said. How do you know? Because you don't say things to people before. He was quiet. No, he said. I don't. The fire behind them settled. The night outside was very still. The wolf was warm in her chest, and his hand was warm in hers, and the mark on her wrist caught the firelight and gleamed quietly, the sigil of a bond that was 300 years old in the written record and considerably older than that in the actual bone of things. She had been nobody. She had been erased and contained and drugged and told, every morning of 5 years, that she was the nothing she appeared to be. She had refused. Not because she'd known what she was refusing for, not because she'd had a plan or a prophecy or a king waiting for her in the mountains. She had refused because the 17-year-old girl who woke up in a rotting cabin with no memory had looked at the available options and determined that becoming nobody for real was not one of them. That girl had been right. She had been right about that, and she had been right about North, and she had been right about Stone knowing where to go, and she had been right about the tea, and she had been right to run. Outside the window, the Greymaw Mountains held the dark. The wolf in her chest breathed, and Leora Vale, Lord of Alderath, surviving heir of an unextinct house, bonded to a blind king who had found his sight, nobody who had refused to stay nobody, looked out at the dark and felt in the full, complex, unperformable way of a person who has come through something real and arrived somewhere true that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because destiny had put her here, because she had. The tribunal at Varen concluded in the summer. Morvena's full confession, delivered with the composed precision of someone honoring a contract, dismantled a network that had operated across 4 territories for 2 decades. 17 individuals were charged. Seraphine testified for 4 days and left Varen with a formal clearance and a hard-won understanding of the difference between complicity and ignorance, which she would spend the rest of her life not repeating. Alderath rose slowly, stone by stone, season by season, the way good things rise, not dramatically, but permanently. By the 3rd year, the river villages had doubled their population. By the 5th, the keep's first wing was complete. Kael Draven's sight returned fully by midsummer of the 1st year. He spent several weeks, Aldrich reported, with the neutrality of a man not touching the subject, simply looking at things. At the spring assembly of the 2nd year, standing in the full hall of Dravenhold with every northern lord present and the eastern territories represented for the first time in 6 years, Kael Draven and Lyora Vale of Alderath claimed their bond before their people. Not because the law required it, not because the prophecy demanded it, but because they chose it, which was the only reason either of them would have accepted. The hall was full. The wolf, in both their chests, was still. Outside, the Greymaw Mountains held the cold and the dark, and the permanent unsentimentality of stone, and the north ran on, and the bond ran through it like a river finding the sea, not dramatic, not demanding, simply following the course of what was true. Which is what bonds do, which is what wolves do, which is what people do when they refuse to be nobody and find their way home.